Hey there, welcome to Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In Cleveland, Ohio, where the winters bite and summers hum with humidity, the Rocky River winds through the city like a quiet witness to its history. In February 1975, its banks held a secret that would remain buried for nearly 4 decades, until a young biology student named Christina Skates stumbled upon a mystery that would change her life and restore a lost identity. The air was crisp that winter day when children, playing near the river's edge, found something that didn't belong among the reeds and pebbles. Human remains, a skeleton stripped of flesh, a life erased without a name. The discovery barely rippled through the local news, a brief mention in the papers, quickly forgotten by a city preoccupied with its own daily grind. The body was labeled unknown white female bones, line 82483 in the cemetery records, and buried in an unmarked grave in Potter's Field at Memorial Garden Cemetery. No family claimed her. No one mourned her. She was a ghost, lost to time. But in 2014, Christina Skates, a 23-year-old student at Cleveland State University, sat in a quiet library, her eyes scanning microfiche archives and cemetery records for a genealogy project that was supposed to be nothing more than a school assignment. Her fingers paused over that stark entry, unknown white female bones. Something about it gripped her, a pull she couldn't explain, a sense that this forgotten woman deserved more than anonymity. Christina, with her methodical mind and a passion for unraveling puzzles, wasn't one to let mysteries lie dormant. What began as a fleeting curiosity would spiral into a years-long quest, one that would crack open a 40-year-old murder case, expose systemic failures, and give a name back to someone erased from history. This is the story of how Christina Skates, armed with little more than determination and a knack for tracing family trees, solved the impossible, a cold case that had baffled investigators for decades. The library at Cleveland State University was a sanctuary of soft hums and rustling pages, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over rows of bookshelves. Christina Skates sat hunched over a microfiche reader, her dark hair tucked behind her ears, her glasses reflecting the grainy images flickering across the screen. It was a late afternoon in 2014, and the library was nearly empty, save for a few students cramming for exams. Christina, a biology major with a penchant for precision, had always found solace in the meticulous. Her classmates knew her as the one who could spend hours cross-referencing data, piecing together patterns others overlooked. Genealogy was her side passion, a hobby that satisfied her need to connect dots across generations. She'd traced her own family back to 18th century Ireland, delighting in the stories she uncovered, tales of farmers, immigrants, and quiet lives etched into faded records. That day, her assignment was simple: explore local cemetery records for a project on genealogical research methods. She scrolled through the digital archives of Memorial Garden Cemetery, a place where Cleveland buried its unclaimed, its forgotten. The entries were clinical, almost cruel in their brevity: names, dates, causes of death when known. Then line 82,483 stopped her cold. Unknown white female bones. February 5th, 1975. No name, no story, just a void. Christina leaned closer, her breath catching. She'd seen plenty of unmarked graves in her research, paupers, stillborns, the homeless, but this felt different. This wasn't just an unclaimed body. This was someone who had been murdered, her remains found by children, her life reduced to a single line in a ledger. She jotted down the details in her notebook, her handwriting neat but hurried. Who was this woman? Why had no one claimed her? The questions gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the image of those bones, lying cold and alone by the rocky river. She pushed the microfiche aside and opened her laptop, searching for any mention of a body found in Cleveland in February 1975. The results were dishearteningly sparse. A brief article in the Plain Dealer mentioned the discovery. Children playing near the rocky river had stumbled upon skeletal remains, partially buried in the muddy bank. The police had investigated, but with no identification, no missing persons reports matching the description, and no immediate leads. The case had gone cold almost as soon as it was opened. The article noted that the remains suggested a young woman, likely in her 20s, and that the cause of death was undetermined but suspected to be homicide. That was it. No follow-up stories, no public outcry. Just a fleeting mention, buried in the back pages. Christina felt a pang of frustration. In 1975, Cleveland was a city in flux, its industrial heart still beating but starting to falter. Crime was a constant hum in the background, robberies, assaults, the occasional high-profile murder, but a Jane Doe found by the river barely registered. The police had done what they could with the tools of the time. Dental records were checked, but no match was found. Missing persons reports were scoured, but none fit. There was a brief, hopeful theory that the remains might belong to Patty Hearst, the heiress kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974, whose disappearance was a national obsession. But dental records quickly ruled that out. The case was shelved, the woman's bones laid to rest in Potter's Field, and the world moved on. But Christina couldn't move on. She felt a connection to this nameless woman, a sense of responsibility she couldn't articulate. Maybe it was her own stubborn streak, the same one that had driven her to solve a family mystery about a great-great-uncle no one else could trace. Maybe it was the injustice of it all, a life snuffed out, a story erased. Whatever it was, Christina made a decision that would consume the next several years of her life. She would find out who this woman was and, if possible, how she died. Her first step was to dig deeper into the records. She visited the Cuyahoga County Coroner's office, a squat, unassuming building that held the city's grim secrets. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, was initially skeptical of Christina's request. "You're looking for what now?" she asked, peering over her glasses. "A Jane Doe from 75? Honey, those files are probably gathering dust in the basement." But Christina was persistent, her voice steady but polite. She explained her project, emphasizing her academic credentials and her experience in genealogy. After some cajoling, the clerk relented, leading her to a storage room stacked with boxes of yellowing files. The air smelled of mildew and old paper, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Christina spent hours sifting through records, her fingers smudged with dust, until she found the file labeled Jane Doe, Rocky River, 1975. It was thinner than she'd hoped, containing just a few pages. A coroner's report, a police summary, and a grainy photograph of the site where the remains were found. The coroner's report noted that the skeleton was that of a female, estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old, with no obvious signs of trauma on the bones. The cause of death was listed as undetermined possible homicide, a vague conclusion that reflected the limitations of 1970s forensic science. The police report added little more. The remains were found by two boys, aged 10 and 12, who had been exploring the riverbank. There were no personal effects, no clothing, nothing to hint at who she was or how she ended up there. Christina took meticulous notes, photographing each page with her phone. The lack of evidence was frustrating, but it also fueled her determination. If the police couldn't solve this in 1975, she would use the tools of the modern era, databases, DNA analysis, and the vast digital archives of the internet. She returned to the library, diving into newspaper archives again, hoping to find something the police had missed. She cross-referenced missing persons reports from Ohio and neighboring states, looking for women in their 20s who vanished around 1974 or 1975. The process was slow, like piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Many records from that era were incomplete, and missing persons cases were often poorly documented, especially for women who might have been transients, runaways, or otherwise on the margins of society. Weeks turned into months, and Christina's project became an obsession. She spent her evenings in her small apartment, surrounded by stacks of genealogy books and her laptop glowing with open tabs. Her roommate, Sarah, a cheerful nursing student, would tease her gently. "You're like a detective in one of those crime shows," she'd say, peering over Christina's shoulder at a screen full of Ancestry.com searches. But Sarah saw the fire in Christina's eyes, the way she lit up when she talked about her Jane Doe. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was a mission. Christina's breakthrough came when she discovered the power of genetic genealogy. In 2014, DNA databases like GeneMatch were gaining traction among amateur genealogists, allowing users to upload DNA profiles and find matches with distant relatives. And Christina saw its potential for her Jane Doe. The problem was accessing the DNA. The coroner's office had retained bone samples from the 1975 case, but getting permission to test them was a bureaucratic nightmare. Christina reached out to the Cleveland Police Department's Cold Case Unit, a small team of overworked detectives who were initially dismissive. "We've got dozens of cases like this," one detective told her over the phone, his voice gruff but not unkind. "What makes you think you can crack this one?" "I don't know if I can," Christina admitted, her voice steady. "But I have to try. She deserves a name." The detective, a man named Paul Riley, softened at her sincerity. He'd seen plenty of armchair sleuths come and go, but there was something about Christina, her quiet determination, her refusal to give up, that stuck with him. He agreed to help her navigate the system, pulling strings to get the bone samples sent to a forensic lab for DNA extraction. It was a long shot, but if they could generate a viable DNA profile, Christina could upload it to GeneMatch and start building a family tree. The lab process was agonizingly slow. Weeks passed with no updates, and Christina threw herself into her studies to keep from obsessing. She was in her final year at Cleveland State, juggling exams and lab work while checking her email obsessively for news from the lab. When the results finally came, they were a mixed bag. The DNA was degraded, but the lab had managed to extract enough to create a partial profile. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to work with. Christina uploaded the profile to GeneMatch, her heart pounding as the system processed the data. Matches began to appear, distant cousins, fourth or fifth removed, their connections to the Jane Doe faint but traceable. Building the family tree was like assembling a mosaic from scattered shards. Christina spent hours mapping out relationships, cross-referencing names with birth records, marriage licenses, and obituaries. She reached out to potential relatives, carefully wording her emails to avoid alarming them. "I'm working on a genealogy project," she'd write, "and I think you might be related to someone I'm researching." Most responses were polite but unhelpful. Many people didn't know their own family history beyond a generation or two. But one match, a woman named Linda from Pennsylvania, provided a crucial clue. Linda's great-grandmother had a sister who'd moved to Ohio in the 1960s, a woman named Margaret who had a daughter named Susan. Susan, Linda recalled, had run away from home as a teenager and was never heard from again. Christina's pulse quickened as she dug into Susan's story. Susan Marie Thompson, born in 1952, had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Akron. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a homemaker who struggled with alcoholism. Susan was a bright but rebellious teenager, drawn to the counterculture of the early 1970s. She left home at 17, telling her family she was heading to Cleveland to start a new life. Her parents filed a missing persons report in 1973, but the trail went cold. The police assumed she'd run off to join a commune or follow a boyfriend, a common story in an era when young people often slipped through society's cracks. The pieces were starting to fit. Susan's age matched the coroner's estimate, and her disappearance in 1973 aligned with the timeline of the remains found in 1975. Christina contacted Detective Riley, who pulled the old missing persons file on Susan Thompson. The file included a description: 5 feet 4 inches, brown hair, blue eyes, a small scar on her left knee from a childhood accident. The Jane Doe skeleton had shown no such scar, but bones alone couldn't confirm or deny it. What they needed was a DNA match. Christina tracked down Susan's younger sister, Diane, who was living in Florida. Diane was wary when Christina called, her voice thick with years of unresolved grief. "We gave up hope a long time ago," Diane said, her words clipped. "If you're trying to sell me something, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything," Christina said gently. "I think I might have found your sister." There was a long pause on the line, followed by a shaky exhale. Diane agreed to provide a DNA sample, a simple cheek swab that could confirm whether the Jane Doe was Susan. The sample was sent to the lab, and Christina waited, her nerves frayed. She tried to focus on her classes, but her thoughts kept drifting to Susan, imagining her life. A young woman full of dreams, caught in a moment of history when freedom and danger walked hand in hand. The call from Detective Riley came on a rainy afternoon in 2016. Christina was in her apartment, surrounded by textbooks, when her phone buzzed. "It's a match," Riley said, his voice carrying a rare note of excitement. "The DNA confirms it. Your Jane Doe is Susan Marie Thompson." Christina felt a rush of triumph mixed with sorrow. Susan was no longer a ghost, but her story was far from complete. The DNA match gave her a name, but it didn't explain how she died or who was responsible. Christina and Riley met at a coffee shop near the police station to discuss next steps. Riley, a grizzled veteran with graying hair and a perpetually tired expression, slid a folder across the table. "This is everything we've got on Susan," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start." The folder contained the original missing persons report, a few grainy photos of Susan as a teenager, and notes from interviews with her parents in 1973. Susan had been a free spirit, drawn to Cleveland's music scene and the bohemian vibe of the city's west side. She'd worked odd jobs, waitressing, clerking at a record store, but had no fixed address. Friends described her as charismatic but impulsive, prone to trusting the wrong people. The police had suspected she might have fallen in with a rough crowd, possibly involved in drugs or petty crime, but there was no evidence to confirm it. Christina pored over the file, her mind racing. Solving the identity was only half the battle. Now she wanted justice. She teamed up with Riley and a forensic genealogist named Dr. Ellen Carter, a specialist in cold cases who'd been following Christina's work with interest. Together, they combed through Susan's life, trying to reconstruct her final months. They interviewed old friends, tracked down former co-workers, and scoured social media for any mention of Susan from people who might have known her. Most leads were dead ends, but one name kept surfacing: a man named Robert Bobby Malone, a small-time drug dealer who'd been seen with Susan in 1974. Malone was a shadow in Cleveland's underworld, a charming but volatile figure known for his temper and his knack for avoiding arrest. Witnesses recalled seeing him with Susan at a bar on West 25th Street, a gritty spot popular with the counterculture crowd. One woman, a former bartender named Judy, told Christina and Riley that Susan had seemed nervous around Malone, as if she owed him something. "She was a sweet kid," Judy said, her voice heavy with regret. "But she was in over her head with Bobby. He wasn't the kind of guy you crossed." The trail to Malone was faint but promising. Riley pulled his criminal record, a string of arrests for drug possession, assault, and theft, but no convictions strong enough to keep him behind bars. By 2016, Malone was in his 60s, living in a trailer park in rural Ohio. Riley and Christina drove out to question him, the road stretching through fields of corn and soybean under a gray sky. Malone's trailer was a rusted relic, surrounded by weeds and broken furniture. He answered the door in a stained t-shirt, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Riley's badge. "We're here about Susan Thompson," Riley said, his tone firm but neutral. "You knew her in the 70s. Malone's face betrayed nothing, but his hands twitched slightly. "Don't know any Susan," he said, his voice rough. "You got the wrong guy." Christina watched him closely, noting the way his eyes darted to the side. She'd learned to read people during her genealogy work, picking up on the subtle signs of discomfort. Malone was hiding something, but without evidence, they couldn't press him. Riley left his card, and they drove back to Cleveland, the silence between them heavy with frustration. The investigation stalled, but Christina refused to give up. She turned to the public, posting about the case on genealogy forums and true crime message boards. Her posts caught the attention of a local journalist, Mark Davies, who wrote a feature on Susan's case for the Plain Dealer. The article, titled "The Girl by the River," sparked renewed interest, and tips began to trickle in. Most were useless, vague memories, wild theories, but one stood out: a woman named Karen, who claimed to have been Susan's roommate in 1974, emailed Christina with a story that sent chills down her spine. Karen, now in her 60s and living in Michigan, said she and Susan had shared an apartment in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood. Susan had been working at a diner, trying to save money to leave Ohio, when she met Malone. According to Karen, Malone had promised Susan a way out, a job opportunity in Chicago, but it came with a price. He wanted her to transport drugs across state lines. Susan, desperate for a fresh start, had agreed, but when she tried to back out, Malone turned violent. Karen last saw Susan in late 1974, bruised and scared, saying she was going to confront Malone. That was the last anyone heard from her. Karen's story gave Riley enough to justify a deeper look into Malone. He obtained a warrant to search Malone's property, hoping to find something, anything, that tied him to Susan's death. The search turned up little. A few old photos, drug paraphernalia, nothing conclusive. But in a dusty box in the trailer's crawl space, they found a woman's ring, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone. Karen later identified it as Susan's, a gift from her mother she always wore. The ring was the break they needed. Riley brought Malone in for questioning, this time with the ring as leverage. Malone stuck to his story, claiming he'd never met Susan, but his composure cracked when Riley showed him the ring. "Lots of girls wore cages like that," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The police sent the ring for forensic testing, hoping for DNA or trace evidence, but the results were inconclusive. The case was still circumstantial, and without a confession or stronger evidence, charging Malone was a long shot. Christina, meanwhile, was grappling with the emotional weight of the case. She'd spent years imagining Susan's life, piecing together her story from fragments. Susan wasn't just a name anymore. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a dreamer who'd fallen into a trap she couldn't escape. Christina visited Susan's grave in Potter's Field, now marked with a simple headstone thanks to donations from the genealogy community. She stood there in the rain, whispering, "I'm sorry it took so long." In 2018, the case took an unexpected turn. A retired detective, Tom Wheeler, contacted Riley after reading the Plain Dealer article. Wheeler had worked the Jane Doe case in 1975 and remembered a detail that never made it into the official reports. A witness, a truck driver, had reported seeing a young woman matching Susan's description arguing with a man near the Rocky River a few days before the remains were found. The man had driven a beat-up Chevy, similar to one Malone was known to own in the 1970s. The witness had been deemed unreliable at the time. His story was vague, and he'd been drinking, but Wheeler had always regretted not following up. Riley tracked down the truck driver, now an elderly man living in West Virginia. His memory was fuzzy, but he confirmed the details. A young woman, scared and yelling, and a man who looked like he was in control. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it strengthened the case against Malone. Riley and Christina built a timeline, piecing together Susan's last days. Her argument with Malone, her disappearance, the discovery of her remains. They theorized that Malone had killed her, perhaps in a fit of rage, and dumped her body by the river, where it lay undiscovered until the children found it. In 2019, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office reviewed the case. The evidence was still circumstantial, no murder weapon, no DNA linking Malone directly to the crime. But the ring, the witness accounts, and Karen's testimony painted a compelling picture. Malone was charged with second-degree murder, a decision that made headlines across Ohio. Christina sat in the courtroom during the trial, her heart pounding as the prosecution laid out the case. Malone, now frail and gray, maintained his innocence, his lawyer arguing that the evidence was too thin, the memories too old. The defense leaned heavily on the lack of forensic proof, painting Susan as a troubled runaway who could have met any number of fates. The trial was a grueling 3 weeks, each day a battle of narratives. Christina testified about her role in identifying Susan, her voice steady as she described the years of work that led to the DNA match. Diane, Susan's sister, took the stand, her eyes red with tears as she spoke of the sister she'd lost. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and when they returned, the courtroom was silent. "Not guilty," the foreman said, and Christina felt the air leave her lungs. Malone walked free, his face unreadable as he left the courthouse. The verdict was a blow, but Christina refused to let it define the case. She had given Susan her name back, a victory that mattered more than she could have imagined when she started. She worked with Diane to organize a memorial for Susan, held at Memorial Garden Cemetery on a bright spring day in 2020. Friends, family, and strangers who'd followed the case gathered to honor a woman they'd never known, but whose story had touched them. Christina spoke at the memorial, her voice breaking as she read a poem she'd written for Susan. "You were more than bones by the river, more than a name lost to time. You were a daughter, a dreamer, a light that refused to fade. We see you now." After the memorial, Christina sat with Diane by Susan's grave, the new headstone gleaming in the sunlight. "Thank you," Diane said, her hand squeezing Christina's. "You brought her back to us." Christina nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't caught Susan's killer, but she had done something perhaps more profound. She had reclaimed a life from the shadows. The case of Susan Marie Thompson remains unsolved, a reminder of the limits of justice and the power of persistence. For Christina Skates, now a forensic genealogist working on other cold cases, the journey began with a single line in a cemetery record and ended with a truth that echoed beyond the grave. Susan was no longer Jane Doe. She was home. Story 2. The morning of November 30th, 2004, dawned cold and crisp along the Vaal River, where the flat, open landscape of Lindequestrif, South Africa, stretched beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath. The air carried the faint tang of damp earth and wood smoke, mingling with the laughter and chatter of a small group of campers at the Van Beau Resort. Among them was Dawn Violet Byrne, a 23-year-old woman whose life, until that moment, had been a quiet tapestry of modest dreams and deep friendships. She was petite, standing at just 1.54 meters, with brown hair that fell in soft waves and brown eyes that sparkled with a quiet intensity. A visible scar marked her forehead, and a playful green frog tattoo adorned her upper left arm, a small rebellion against the conventional path she'd never quite followed. Dawn had come to the resort with her older brother, Jonathan, his fiancée, Emma, and a handful of friends, seeking a weekend of escape from the bustle of Johannesburg. They had pitched their tents, shared stories around a crackling fire, and let the rhythm of the river lull them into a sense of peace. But by the time the sun rose that morning, Dawn was gone, and the tranquility of the campsite would unravel into a mystery that would haunt those who loved her for years to come. Dawn's story began in Nilstrom, a small town in Mpumalanga, where she grew up in a close-knit family. Her childhood was unremarkable in the way that happy childhoods often are, filled with the small joys of rural life, from chasing her younger brother, Alan, through dusty fields to listening to her mother's stories under the wide African sky. Her father, a quiet man with calloused hands from years of working the land, taught her to find beauty in the simplicity of the world around her. Her mother, a schoolteacher, instilled in her a love of learning and a curiosity that burned bright. Dawn was the middle child, sandwiched between Jonathan, the ambitious older brother who dreamed of seeing the world, and Alan, the sensitive younger one who looked up to her with unwavering devotion. She was the glue that held their small family together, her laughter a constant in their modest home. But Dawn was restless, her spirit too big for Nilström's quiet boundaries. After high school, she set her sights on Johannesburg, a city that pulsed with possibility. She enrolled at a university, studying literature and dreaming of a life filled with adventure. She moved into a small cottage in Kensington, a suburb where jacaranda trees cast purple shadows on the streets. The cottage was her sanctuary, its walls adorned with sketches and photographs, its shelves lined with books she'd read until the pages were worn. It was there that she met Alicia, a fellow student whose fiery energy matched Dawn's quieter intensity. Alicia was drawn to Dawn's warmth, her quick laugh, and the way she seemed to carry a spark of defiance beneath her gentle exterior. They became inseparable, spending evenings in smoky cafes, debating poetry, or planning trips they couldn't yet afford. Alicia saw in Dawn a rare kind of authenticity, a woman who lived for the moment, who found joy in the smallest details, from the curve of a leaf to the rhythm of a song. When Jonathan announced he was visiting from the UK with his fiancée, Emma, Dawn was overjoyed. Jonathan had left South Africa after school, chasing a career in London, and their time apart had stretched their bond thin. The camping trip to Van Bo was Dawn's idea, a chance to reconnect, to share the beauty of her country with Emma, who'd never seen the Vaal River's shimmering expanse. Alicia was meant to join them, but a bout of bronchitis kept her in Johannesburg, coughing and miserable. "Go without me," she told Dawn over the phone, her voice hoarse. "I'll be fine. Just don't do anything stupid, okay?" Dawn laughed, promising to bring back stories and a sunburn. The group, Jonathan, Emma, Dawn, and 3 friends from Johannesburg, piled into 2 cars and drove to Lindequestriff, a 2-hour journey through rolling hills and open plains. Van Bo was everything Dawn had hoped for. The resort was rustic, its grounds dotted with tents and caravans, the river glinting like a ribbon of silver in the distance. They arrived on November 27, 2004, their cars kicking up clouds of dust as they pulled into the campsite. Dawn was in high spirits, her laughter echoing as she helped set up the tents, her hands deft as she drove stakes into the ground. Jonathan watched her, marveling at how she seemed lighter than she had in years, as if the weight of city life had lifted in the open air. Emma, new to South Africa's rugged beauty, was enchanted by the landscape and Dawn's infectious enthusiasm. The group spent their days hiking along the river, their boots sinking into the soft earth, and their evenings around a fire, passing bottles of beer and sharing stories. Dawn, with her knack for storytelling, held them spellbound with tales of her childhood in Nilström, her voice rising and falling like the river itself. On the night of November 29th, the group stayed up late, the fire casting long shadows across the campsite. They'd had a few drinks, the kind of easy indulgence that comes with being young and carefree. Dawn, usually the life of the group, was quieter than usual, her gaze drifting to the dark expanse beyond the firelight. Jonathan noticed but thought little of it. She was often introspective, prone to moments of quiet reflection. Emma, caught up in the group's laughter, later recalled Dawn sitting slightly apart, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The other campers, friends from Johannesburg who knew Dawn less intimately, didn't notice anything amiss. They went to bed around midnight, the fire reduced to embers, the night silent but for the soft rush of the river. When Jonathan woke at dawn, the campsite was still, the air heavy with dew. He unzipped his tent, expecting to see Dawn already up, perhaps brewing coffee or walking by the river. Her tent was empty, her sleeping bag neatly rolled, her backpack untouched. Her phone, wallet, and a pair of sneakers sat in a corner, as if she'd stepped out for a moment. Jonathan's first thought was that she'd gone for a walk. She loved early mornings, the way the light broke over the landscape. But as the minutes turned to hours, worry crept in. He roused the others, their faces bleary with sleep, and they began calling her name, their voices carrying across the empty fields. Emma, her voice trembling, suggested checking the riverbank. The group fanned out, their footsteps quickening as panic set in. By midday, with no sign of Dawn, Jonathan called Alicia, his voice tight with fear. "She's not here," he said. "I don't know where she is." Alicia felt her world tilt. She was still in bed, her chest heavy with bronchitis, but Jonathan's words sent a jolt through her. She urged him to contact the police, to search every inch of the campsite. She wanted to drive to Lindquestref herself, but her illness pinned her to Johannesburg, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Dawn wandered off and gotten lost? Had she fallen into the river? The thought was unbearable, but Alicia clung to the hope that Dawn was somewhere close, perhaps disoriented but safe. Jonathan, meanwhile, called the Frankfurt police, a small station serving the rural communities along the Vaal. Captain Judith Swanepoel, a woman with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, arrived at Van Bo within hours, her team trailing behind her. The campsite was a scene of quiet chaos, tents flapping in the breeze, the group huddled together, their faces pale with worry. Swanepoel surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. The campsite offered no immediate clues, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, no abandoned belongings. Dawn's tent was tidy, her belongings arranged with the care of someone who hadn't planned to leave. Swanepoel interviewed the group, her notepad filling with their accounts. Jonathan, his hands trembling, recounted the previous night, admitting they'd all had a few drinks but insisting nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Emma, her voice breaking, mentioned Dawn's quiet mood but could offer no explanation. The other campers, a mix of university friends and acquaintances, were equally bewildered, their stories aligning in a way that suggested no foul play within the group. Swanepoel's team searched the campsite, their boots crunching on the gravel, their eyes scanning for anything out of place. They found nothing. The search expanded quickly. Volunteers from Lindquestref joined the police, their faces etched with concern for a young woman they'd never met. The Vaal River, deceptively calm, became a focal point. Its currents were known to be treacherous, and drownings were not uncommon. Divers plunged into the cold water, their movements methodical, but they surfaced empty-handed. Sniffer dogs roamed the area, their noses to the ground, but the trail went cold at the edge of the campsite. Swanepoel, speaking to the citizen, expressed her frustration. "We are trying our best to find out what happened to Dawn. I find it difficult to believe that a person can disappear for almost 4 years without a trace." The lack of evidence was maddening. No witnesses reported seeing Dawn leave the campsite. No vehicles had been spotted in the area that night. The case felt like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. Alicia, still in Johannesburg, was consumed by guilt. She replayed her decision to stay home, wondering if her presence might have changed the outcome. She contacted Dawn's family, who gathered in Johannesburg to support the search. Alan, now 20, was quiet but resolute, his jaw set as he joined volunteers to distribute flyers across Lindquestref and beyond. The flyers were stark, printed in black and white, with a photo of Dawn smiling, her brown eyes bright. They described her in vivid detail. 1.54 meters tall, brown hair, brown eyes, a scar on her forehead, a green frog tattoo on her upper left arm. They pleaded for information, offering Swanepoel's contact number and Alicia's email. The story spread through local media, with headlines that captured the public's imagination. Mystery of the missing camper. Where is Dawn Byrne? Alicia hired private detectives, their offices cluttered with maps and case files, but their searches led nowhere. She consulted psychics who spoke of vague visions, a woman by water, a sense of confusion, but their words offered no concrete leads. Trackers scoured the area around Van Bo, their eyes trained on the ground, but the landscape, vast and unforgiving, held its secrets tightly. As weeks turned to months, theories multiplied. Some speculated that Dawn had wandered off and fallen into the river, her body carried away by the current. The Vaal's waters were deep in places, its banks tangled with reeds that could hide a body for years. Others wondered if she'd been abducted, though the lack of evidence made this seem unlikely. The absence of her phone and wallet suggested she hadn't planned to leave, yet the untouched campsite ruled out a violent struggle. Alicia clung to the hope that Dawn was alive, perhaps lost or disoriented, but the lack of communication gnawed at her. Dawn was not the type to vanish without a word. She was too connected to her family, her friends, her life in Johannesburg. Jonathan, racked with guilt for not noticing her absence sooner, returned to the UK, his visit overshadowed by grief. Alan stayed in Johannesburg, his life on hold as he waited for answers. Dawn's parents, aging and frail, made daily calls to Swanepoel, their voices breaking with each unanswered question. The media frenzy peaked in early 2005, with television crews descending on Linda Questriff, their cameras capturing the desolate beauty of the Vaal River. Reporters interviewed locals, who spoke of Dawn with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. "She seemed like a nice girl," one camper told a journalist, his face weathered by the sun. "It's like she just vanished into thin air." The story resonated beyond South Africa, with international outlets picking it up, drawn to the mystery of a young woman disappearing without a trace. Alicia became the public face of the search, her voice steady but her eyes haunted as she spoke to reporters. "Dawn is out there," she said in one interview, her hands clasped tightly. "She has to be." By 2006, the case had begun to fade from the headlines. New tragedies, new mysteries took precedence, and the public's attention drifted. Swanepoel, though, kept the file active, her determination unshaken. She followed every lead, no matter how small. A reported sighting in southern Johannesburg sent police scrambling, but it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Another tip from KwaZulu-Natal suggested Dawn had been seen at a market, but the woman in question was someone else. Each false lead was a fresh wound, a reminder of how little they knew. Alicia, unwilling to let the case grow cold, poured her savings into the search, hiring more detectives, printing more flyers. She organized vigils, where friends and strangers lit candles and prayed for Dawn's return. The vigils were somber, the flickering lights a stark contrast to the darkness of the unknown. In 2008, 3.5 years after Dawn's disappearance, Alicia wrote a piece for The Citizen titled "Dawn, Where Are You?" It was a raw, unflinching account of her grief, her guilt, and her unrelenting hope. "Dawn was more than a name on a flyer," she wrote. "She was the person who made you laugh when you wanted to cry, who saw the world with the kind of wonder most of us lose. I won't stop looking for her." The article stirred renewed interest, prompting a handful of tips, but none led to Dawn. Alicia's words resonated with readers, who sent messages of support, but no actionable information. The piece was a cry into the void, a testament to a friendship that refused to fade. Captain Swanepoel, reading the article in her office, felt a pang of frustration. She had seen cases like this before, missing persons who left no trace, no closure. But Dawn's case felt personal, a puzzle she couldn't let go. The years stretched on, each one heavier than the last. By 2010, Dawn would have been 29, an age that felt impossibly distant from the vibrant 23-year-old who had vanished. Alicia, now working as a teacher, kept Dawn's memory alive in small ways. A photo on her desk, a green frog pendant she wore around her neck. Alan, hardened by years of uncertainty, moved to Cape Town, seeking a fresh start, but he carried a locket with Dawn's picture, a talisman against despair. Their parents, now in their late 60s, lived in a quiet limbo, their home filled with reminders of the daughter they'd lost. They prayed for closure, for a sign, but none came. Swanepoel, nearing retirement, kept Dawn's file on her desk, a quiet promise to a case she'd never solved. Theories persisted, whispered in Linda Questriff's bars and Johannesburg's cafes. Some believed Dawn had chosen to disappear, seeking a new life far from the pressures of her old one. But those who knew her dismissed this. She was too close to her family, too rooted in her friendships, to walk away without a word. Others clung to the river theory, imagining her swept away in the dark, her body lost to the Vaal's depths. The abduction theory lingered, too, fueled by the absence of evidence, but no ransom demands or suspicious activity ever surfaced. The truth remained elusive, a shadow just out of reach. By 2025, Dawn would have been 44, a fact that struck Alicia like a physical blow. She imagined Dawn as she might have been, perhaps a mother, a teacher, or an artist, her life filled with the vibrancy she'd always carried. The campsite at Van Bo had changed, its grounds modernized with new cabins and paved paths. But the river remained, its waters as inscrutable as ever. Alicia visited occasionally, standing by the bank where Dawn had last been seen, her eyes searching the horizon. She no longer expected answers, but she couldn't stop looking. Swanepoel, now retired, passed the case to a younger officer, but she checked in occasionally, her voice soft with regret. The mystery of Dawn Violet Byrne had become a ghost story in Lyndequestriff, whispered by locals who remembered the search, the flyers, the young woman who vanished without a trace. For those who loved Dawn, the absence was a wound that never healed. Alicia, now in her 40s, lived with a quiet ache, her home filled with photos of Dawn, smiling at university, laughing at a cafe, standing by the Vaal River days before she disappeared. Alan, now a father himself, told his children about their aunt, his voice steady but his eyes distant. Their parents, too old to hope, prayed for closure before their time ran out. The case remained open, a file in Frankfurt's police station, but the world had moved on. Dawn's green frog tattoo, her scar, her bright eyes, they lingered in memory, a puzzle unsolved, a story unfinished. The Vaal River still flows, its surface catching the light of each new dawn. Somewhere, perhaps, it holds the truth of what happened to Dawn Violet Byrne. Until that truth is found, her name remains a whisper on the wind, a call unanswered, a mystery that binds those who loved her in a shared, unending vigil. Story 3. The night of August 21st, 2010, was warm and restless in Great Bend, Kansas, a small town of about 15,000 souls where the flat horizon stretched endlessly under a star-streaked sky. Alicia DeBalt, a 14-year-old with a cheerleader's energy and a smile that could light up a room, slipped out of her home at 910 Stone Street just before midnight. She was dressed for a party, her heart buzzing with the excitement of a weekend before her freshman year at Great Bend High School. Her mother, Tammy Conrad, was used to Alicia's occasional late-night outings, but they had an agreement. Alicia would call or text if she was running late. That night, her phone pinged with messages from a man she'd met a month earlier, a 36-year-old factory worker named Adam Longoria. His text promised a night of fun, a house full of people and plenty of drinks. "I can pick up and we can go out and party, we will have fun," he wrote at 9:58 p.m. Alicia, trusting and eager, replied with a simple K and sent her address. By 11:01 p.m., Longoria texted, "Be there in 3 minutes." A minute later, he added, "I'm here." A neighbor saw Alicia climb into a black Ford Escape. By morning, she was gone, her absence a silent scream that would shatter her family and shake Great Bend to its core. 3 days later, her charred remains were found at an asphalt plant, and a town's innocence burned with her. Alicia DeBalt was born on September 25, 1995, in a town where life revolved around high school football, church suppers, and the steady hum of the oil industry. She was the youngest of Tammy Conrad's children, a bright-eyed girl nicknamed Baby Girl for her playful spirit and knack for making friends. Her family described her as vivacious, the kind of person who didn't know a stranger and would help anyone in need. At 14, she was on the cusp of high school, a cheerleader with dreams of performing under the Friday night lights. Her room was a collage of teenage life, posters of pop stars, pom-poms in the corner, and a diary filled with hopes for the future. Great Bend, nestled in the heart of Kansas, was a place where everyone knew everyone, and Alicia's warmth made her a beloved figure among her peers. She was excited about the Great Bend High School Booster Club dinner scheduled for August 22nd, an event she'd been talking about for weeks. But that night, she missed it, and her absence set off alarms. Tammy Conrad woke on Sunday morning to an empty house. Alicia's bed was untouched, her phone silent. Panic crept in as Tammy called her daughter's friends, hoping Alicia had crashed at someone's place. But no one had seen her since she left for the party. By late morning, Tammy contacted the Great Bend Police Department, her voice trembling as she reported Alicia missing. The case didn't qualify for an Amber Alert. There was no immediate evidence of abduction, but the police acted swiftly, contacting the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, for support. By Monday, August 23rd, a statewide media advisory was issued, and the search for Alicia became a community effort. Volunteers scoured Great Bend's parks, fields, and backroads, their voices calling her name into the summer heat. Flyers with Alicia's photo, a smiling girl with long dark hair, went up on every lamppost and shop window. The town, still reeling from the recession, came together in a way it hadn't in years, united by a shared fear that something terrible had happened to one of their own. The investigation zeroed in on Adam Longoria, a man whose name surfaced early in the case. Longoria, born in 1974, was a 36-year-old employee at Venture Corporation, an asphalt plant just south of Great Bend. He had a troubled past, having spent much of his adult life in prison for various offenses, including theft and drug charges. Released in 2005, he'd settled in Great Bend, working manual labor jobs and living with his girlfriend, Eva Brown. In July 2010, at a birthday party for Eva, Longoria met Alicia. Prosecutors would later describe him as immediately obsessed with the teenager, a fixation that grew over weeks of relentless texting. He showered her with attention, offering mixed drinks and promises of being his girl. Alicia, young and impressionable, was drawn to his confidence, unaware of the danger lurking behind his words. To her, he was an older friend, someone who made her feel grown up. To him, she was a target. On August 24th, the search ended in tragedy. Workers at the Venture Corporation asphalt plant discovered a body behind a pile of gravel, so badly burned that dental records were needed to confirm it was Alicia. Traces of duct tape clung to her ankles and face, a grim clue to her final moments. The news hit Great Bend like a thunderclap. Over 2,000 people gathered for a vigil on August 29th, holding candles and weeping for the girl they called Baby Girl. Tammy, her face etched with grief, stood among them, clutching a photo of Alicia in her cheerleader uniform. The community's shock turned to anger as details emerged. Longoria had been arrested that day, caught driving a white Ford Explorer stolen from Venture Corporation. He was initially charged with vehicle theft and burglary, but the police were building a larger case. Evidence was mounting: text messages, surveillance footage, and whispers of DNA found at the scene. Detective Brian Doherty, a seasoned officer with the Great Bend Police Department, led the investigation. He was a man of few words, his eyes shadowed by years of seeing the worst in people. The text messages between Longoria and Alicia, recovered from her phone, painted a chilling picture. At 9:58 p.m. on August 21st, Longoria had texted, "I have 5 bottles and 5 cases of beer in one house, and there will be lots of people." Alicia's reply was a single letter, K. At 10:59 p.m., he texted, "Be there in 3 minutes," followed by "I'm here a minute later." The last signal from Alicia's phone was at 11:40 p.m. A neighbor confirmed seeing a black Ford Escape, matching Eva Brown's vehicle. Outside Alicia's house around 11 p.m., Doherty's team dug deeper, uncovering surveillance footage from a convenience store where Longoria bought $1.32 worth of gasoline that night. The purchase, small but damning, suggested a plan to destroy evidence. Eva Brown's testimony would prove pivotal. She told investigators that Longoria came home around 12:30 a.m. on August 22nd, reeking of gasoline. Her black Ford Escape, which she'd lent him, smelled of fuel the next morning. She recalled him washing his clothes that night, an unusual act, and later shredding a t-shirt, asking her to dispose of it. Forensic examiners found gasoline on Longoria's gym shoes, and more critically, semen stains on the floor of the Ford Escape, containing a mixture of DNA matching both Longoria and Alicia. Witnesses reported Longoria asking them to lie about his whereabouts, claiming someone else had taken his car and phone that night. But the evidence was stacking against him, each piece a brick in the wall closing him in. On September 7, 2010, Longoria was charged with capital murder, criminal sodomy, aggravated criminal sodomy, and attempted rape, along with vehicle theft and burglary. He was held in Sedgwick County Jail on a $1.5 million bond, his gaunt face staring blankly in court as Alicia's family watched from the gallery. Tammy and her older daughter, Alicia's sister, were ushered into a side room after hearings, avoiding the swarm of reporters. State Attorney General Steve Six, speaking to the media, called the case completely devastating for the family, urging the public to ignore the horrific rumors circulating online. Longoria's attorney, Jeff Wicks from the Kansas Death Penalty Defense Unit, fought to suppress his client's inconsistent statements to police, but the judge denied the motion. The trial, set for March 2012, would be held in Great Bend, despite Wicks' argument that local outrage made a fair trial impossible. The months leading up to the trial were a torment for Alicia's family. Tammy, a single mother who worked long hours at a local diner, struggled to keep her grief from consuming her. She kept Alicia's room untouched, the pom-poms still in the corner, as if her daughter might walk through the door. Alicia's sister, now 18, withdrew from friends, haunted by the loss of her confidant. The community, too, was fractured. Great Bend was a place where people left their doors unlocked, but Alicia's murder changed that. Parents held their children closer, and the asphalt plant, once just a workplace, became a grim landmark. The vigil had brought thousands together, but the pain lingered, a reminder that evil could touch even a town like theirs. The trial began on March 26, 2012, in Barton County District Court, presided over by Judge Hannelore Kitts. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as prosecutor Kevin O'Connor laid out the case. He painted Longoria as a predator, a man who saw a vulnerable teenager at a July party and became consumed by his desire for her. He began to woo Alicia by fawning over her and providing her with mixed alcohol drinks, O'Connor told the jury. He wanted Alicia to be his girl. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. The text messages, the surveillance video, the gasoline-soaked shoes, and the DNA in the Ford Escape. A witness testified that Longoria had bragged about having sex with Alicia, though he claimed it was consensual and on a different occasion. O'Connor dismissed this, pointing to the DNA and the text messages that showed Longoria luring Alicia to her death. "It is his fault," he said, his voice steady as he pointed at the defendant. Longoria's defense was shaky. Wicks argued that someone else could have used Longoria's car and phone, pointing to DNA from an unknown male found in Alicia's mouth. But the prosecution countered that the text messages, sent from Longoria's phone, showed his intent. The jury, a mix of Great Bend locals and farmers from surrounding counties, listened intently as witnesses recounted the night of August 21st. Eva Brown's testimony was particularly damning, her voice trembling as she described Longoria's behavior. The crime scene photos, though not shown to the public, were described as gruesome, with traces of duct tape suggesting Alicia had been restrained. After 6 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On April 6, 2012, they returned a verdict: guilty of capital murder, criminal sodomy, aggravated criminal sodomy, and attempted rape. The sentencing on June 26, 2012, was a moment of reckoning. Tammy and Alicia's sister delivered victim impact statements, their words raw with grief. Tammy spoke of her daughter's love for cheerleading, her dreams of college, and the void left by her absence. "She was my baby girl," she said, her voice breaking. Longoria, who had not taken the stand during the trial, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table. Judge Kitts, bound by Kansas law, sentenced him to life without parole for the capital murder charge, with additional sentences for the other charges. The courtroom was silent as Longoria was led away, his shackles clinking in the hush. Outside, reporters gathered, but the family slipped away, seeking solace in their private pain. The aftermath was bittersweet for Great Bend. The conviction brought justice, but it couldn't erase the loss. Tammy moved out of the house on Stone Street, unable to bear its memories. The community tried to heal, organizing fundraisers for a scholarship in Alicia's name. The asphalt plant, still operating, became a place people avoided, its gravel piles a haunting reminder. In 2015, the Kansas Supreme Court upheld Longoria's conviction, rejecting his appeal. The ruling was a small victory for the family, but it couldn't fill the emptiness. Alicia's story, covered by outlets like the Daily Mail and CBS News, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of predatory adults and the vulnerability of youth. By 2025, Great Bend had changed, its population slightly dwindled, its streets quieter. Tammy, now in her late 40s, lived with her daughter, working to keep Alicia's memory alive. The cheerleader's smile, captured in photos, remained a beacon of what was lost. The case, featured in a 2018 episode of Investigation Discovery's Web of Lies, resonated beyond Kansas, a reminder of the fragility of trust. For those who knew Alicia, the pain lingered, but so did her light. The town held an annual vigil, lighting candles where her body was found, a silent promise not to forget. Longoria, now in his 50s, remained in prison, his life a stark contrast to the one Alicia might have lived. The truth of that night, how he lured her, what he did before setting her body alight, died with her, leaving only the evidence and a community forever changed. Story 4. In the quiet coastal town of Hermanus, South Africa, where the Atlantic Ocean whispers secrets to the rugged cliffs, and the air carries the faint tang of salt, life unfolds at a leisurely pace. Fishermen cast their nets at dawn, tourists amble along the shorelines marveling at the southern right whales, and locals exchange pleasantries in the shadow of mountains that seem to cradle the town in their ancient embrace. It was here, in this seemingly idyllic setting, that a tragedy unfolded, one that would ripple through the community, leaving scars that time could only hope to soften. The story of Anthony Gerald Brewer, a man whose name became synonymous with a chilling crime, is not just a tale of violence, but a haunting exploration of human fragility, hidden motives, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. The morning of August 15, 2018, began like any other in Hermanus. The sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, while the town stirred to life. In a modest home on the outskirts, where the scent of fynbos mingled with the ocean breeze, 65-year-old Geraldine Brewer prepared breakfast. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades nurturing a family. She hummed softly, a tune from her youth, as she sliced bread and set the kettle to boil. Geraldine was a woman of quiet strength, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes carrying the warmth of a life well lived. She was a mother, a grandmother, a pillar of her small community, known for her kindness and her unwavering devotion to her family. Her husband, Anthony Gerald Brewer, was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. At 67, Anthony was a man of contrasts. His weathered hands spoke of years spent working as a mechanic, while his reserved demeanor hinted at a mind that kept its thoughts closely guarded. To neighbors, he was polite but distant, a man who preferred the solitude of his garage to the chatter of social gatherings. Yet, to Geraldine, he was her partner of over 4 decades, the father of their children, and the steady presence in their shared life. Their marriage, like any, had its ebbs and flows, but on this morning, nothing seemed amiss. The couple exchanged few words, their silence comfortable, born of years spent together. But beneath this ordinary scene, something darker simmered. It was a tension that had been building, imperceptible to the outside world, perhaps even to Geraldine herself. Anthony had been wrestling with demons, financial strain, the weight of aging, and a growing sense of discontent that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. These were not the grand, dramatic conflicts of a crime novel, but the slow, insidious pressures that can erode a person's spirit over time. And on that August morning, those pressures would erupt in a way that would shatter lives and leave a community in disbelief. As Geraldine turned to pour the boiling water into a teapot, Anthony stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The sound was sharp, jarring in the stillness of the morning. Geraldine glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly, but before she could speak, Anthony's hand reached for a knife on the counter. A simple kitchen knife, its blade glinting faintly in the morning light. What happened next was swift and brutal. With a ferocity that seemed to come from a place beyond reason, Anthony attacked his wife, the blade finding her again and again. Geraldine's screams pierced the air, but they were Fleming, drowned out by the relentless violence. Within moments, she collapsed, her life slipping away as blood pooled on the kitchen floor, staining the tiles she had scrubbed clean just the day before. The house fell silent. Anthony stood over his wife's body, his breath ragged, the knife still in his hand. The man who had shared a life with Geraldine, who had built a home and raised children with her, was now a stranger to himself. What had driven him to this act? Was it a sudden explosion of rage, a culmination of years of unspoken grievances, or something deeper, more unfathomable? These questions would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and the community for years to come. But in that moment, Anthony was alone with his actions, the weight of them settling like a stone in his chest. He didn't flee. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table, the knife now resting beside his untouched coffee. He waited, staring at the body of the woman he had vowed to love and protect. It was as if time had paused, the world outside continuing its gentle rhythm while inside, a tragedy had irrevocably altered the course of two lives. Eventually, a neighbor, alarmed by the absence of Geraldine's usual morning routine, knocked on the door. When there was no answer, she peered through the window and saw the horrific scene. Her screams alerted others, and soon the police arrived, their sirens cutting through the tranquility of Hermanus. The officers found Anthony still seated, his expression vacant, his hands stained with blood. He offered no resistance as they handcuffed him, his silence as chilling as the crime itself. Geraldine was pronounced dead at the scene, her body bearing the marks of a frenzied attack, multiple stab wounds, each one a testament to the violence that had erupted in that quiet kitchen. The news spread quickly, a shockwave that rippled through Hermanus and beyond. How could this happen? How could a man like Anthony, known for his quiet demeanor, commit such an act against the woman he had loved for decades? The investigation began immediately, with detectives combing through the Brewer home for clues. The scene was meticulous yet chaotic, blood spatter on the walls, the knife still on the table, and no signs of a struggle that suggested Geraldine had fought back. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or an act of self-defense. It was deliberate, personal, and deeply intimate. The police interviewed neighbors, friends, and family, piecing together a picture of the Brewer's life. They learned of Anthony's financial troubles, a mechanic's pension stretched thin, debts piling up, and a sense of pride that kept him from seeking help. They heard whispers of arguments, not frequent but intense, often about money or the future. Yet, nothing pointed to a history of violence. Geraldine's friends described her as a woman who radiated warmth, who would never have provoked such an attack. Their children, now adults with families of their own, were devastated, unable to reconcile the father they knew with the man who had taken their mother's life. Anthony was charged with murder, and as he was led away in handcuffs, the town grappled with its grief and confusion. The media descended on Hermanus, their cameras and microphones capturing the stunned faces of residents. Headlines in major South African outlets painted a grim picture. Hermanus man arrested for wife's brutal murder. Tragedy in coastal town. Pensioner kills spouse in shocking attack. The stories were careful not to sensationalize, but the weight of the crime was undeniable. For many, it was a reminder that darkness could lurk behind the most ordinary facades. As Anthony awaited trial in a Cape Town detention facility, the legal process began to unfold. Prosecutors built a case rooted in the physical evidence: the knife, the blood, the absence of any other suspects. The autopsy report confirmed what the police had suspected. Geraldine had died from multiple stab wounds, with injuries so severe that she had no chance of survival. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught off guard, perhaps unable to comprehend the betrayal unfolding before her. The prosecution's narrative was straightforward. This was a premeditated act, driven by a man who had reached a breaking point and chosen violence as his outlet. Anthony's defense team, however, painted a different picture. They argued that he had suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues, exacerbated by financial stress and the isolation of retirement. They introduced evidence of his behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime: sleepless nights, irritability, and moments of disorientation reported by close family members. A psychologist testified that Anthony might have been in a dissociative state, his actions not fully under his control. The defense didn't deny the act but sought to frame it as a tragedy born of mental anguish rather than malice. They pleaded for a lesser charge, perhaps manslaughter, arguing that Anthony was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man broken by circumstances. The trial, held in the Western Cape High Court in 2019, was a somber affair. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and curious locals, all drawn to the case that had shattered the illusion of Hermanus as a haven of peace. Anthony sat quietly, his face gaunt, his eyes rarely meeting those of the spectators. The prosecution presented a compelling case, their witnesses recounting the horror of the crime scene and the devastating loss of Geraldine, a woman described as the heart of her family. The defense countered with expert testimony on mental health, but their arguments struggled against the stark reality of the evidence. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience, listened intently, her expression unreadable. The community watched closely, torn between sympathy for Geraldine and a reluctant curiosity about Anthony's motives. Some whispered that he had always been off, a man whose silence hid something sinister. Others, who had known him as a neighbor or co-worker, insisted he was incapable of such cruelty, that something must have snapped. The trial became a mirror for the town's own fears and uncertainties, a reminder that the line between ordinary and monstrous is sometimes terrifyingly thin. When the verdict came, it was swift and unequivocal, guilty of murder. The judge's voice was steady as she delivered the sentence, life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Anthony showed little reaction, his head bowed as he was led from the courtroom. For Geraldine's family, it was a hollow victory. Justice had been served, but it could not bring back the woman whose laughter had once filled their lives. The media reported the outcome with a mix of solemnity and finality, noting the case as a tragic reminder of the hidden struggles that can lurk within any home. In the years that followed, Hermanus tried to heal. The Brewer home was sold, its new owners painting over the memories of that fateful morning. Geraldine's children established a small charity in her name, supporting victims of domestic violence, a cause that felt like a fitting tribute to her memory. Anthony, now in his late 60s, remains in prison, his days marked by routine and regret. Letters from his children, though rare, speak of forgiveness but not forgetting, a delicate balance between love and pain. The case of Anthony Gerald Brewer is not just a story of a crime, but a meditation on the human condition, on how love can coexist with destruction, how ordinary lives can fracture under unseen pressures, and how a single moment can redefine a legacy. For those who walk the streets of Hermanus today, the ocean still whispers, the whales still breach, and life goes on. But the memory of that August morning lingers, a quiet reminder that even in the most serene places, the heart can harbor storms that no one sees coming. Story 5. In the pulsing heart of Berlin, where the night never truly sleeps, the spring of 2012 unfurled like a dark tapestry woven with secrets. The city's nightlife, a vibrant mosaic of techno beats and hedonistic freedom, drew revelers from across the globe. Clubs throbbed with life, their neon signs casting kaleidoscopic glows on cobblestone streets, while the air hummed with the promise of liberation. Berlin's reputation as a haven for self-expression was unmatched, a place where the fall of the wall in 1989 had birthed a new era of permissiveness. Nightclubs stayed open until dawn, and in their shadowy corners, known as darkrooms, strangers sought intimacy under the cloak of anonymity. These spaces, sacred to the city's community, were sanctuaries of freedom, where desire could unfold without judgment. But in the spring of 2012, a shadow crept into these sanctuaries, a predator who would come to be known as the Darkroom Murderer. The story begins in the Friedrichshain district, a gritty yet trendy enclave where artists, students, and clubgoers mingled. On a chilly April evening, the Grosse Freiheit 114, a popular gay bar, buzzed with its usual Friday night energy. The air was thick with the scent of spilled beer and sweat, the bass of techno music vibrating through the walls. Patrons laughed, clinked glasses, and disappeared into the back rooms, where the dim lighting offered privacy. Among them was Nicky Miller, a 32-year-old regular known for his infectious smile and penchant for flamboyant wigs. Nicky, who sometimes passed as a woman in high heels and makeup, was a beloved figure in the scene, his warmth drawing people to him like moths to a flame. He worked at a nearby market, his days filled with the chatter of customers, but the nights were his domain, where he could be unapologetically himself. Nicky moved through the crowd with ease, his laughter cutting through the din. He wore a bright red wig that night, paired with a tight shirt that shimmered under the club's strobe lights. Friends waved him over, offering drinks, but Nicky had his sights set on the darkroom, a space where the world outside ceased to exist. It was a place of whispered promises and fleeting connections, a labyrinth of shadows where identities blurred. For Nicky, it was a place to shed the constraints of the day and embrace the freedom of the night. But on this night, April 6th, 2012, that freedom would betray him. Hours later, as the club began to empty, the atmosphere shifted. The music softened, and the crowd thinned, leaving only the stragglers and the staff. Matthias, a bartender with tired eyes and a quick smile, was wiping down the counter when his co-worker, a lanky man named Stefan, burst out from the back rooms. "There's someone back there," Stefan said, his voice tight. "He's not moving." Matthias assumed it was just another patron who'd had too much to drink, a common occurrence in Berlin's all-night scene. Stefan had placed a glass of water beside the man, muttering about returning in 10 minutes to rouse him. But when he went back, the man still hadn't stirred. A cold dread settled over Matthias as he followed Stefan to the darkroom. The man lay sprawled on the floor, his body unnaturally still. The dim light cast eerie shadows across his face, and Matthias's stomach churned as he recognized Nicky's red wig, now slightly askew. "Call the police," he told Stefan, his voice barely above a whisper. The club's manager was already dialing, his hands shaking as he relayed the situation. Within minutes, the Gross Freiheit 114 was awash in the stark light of emergency vehicles, their sirens slicing through the night. Paramedics confirmed what Matthias feared. Nicky Miller was dead. The police cordoned off the darkroom, their flashlights sweeping over the scene. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no obvious clues to what had happened. Nicky's wallet and phone were missing, suggesting a robbery, but his body bore no marks of violence. The officers, seasoned in Berlin's chaotic nightlife, were puzzled. Could be an overdose, one suggested, but the lack of drug paraphernalia raised doubts. Dr. Sven Hartwig, a coroner with a reputation for meticulousness, arrived at the morgue later that night. He examined Nicky's body under the harsh fluorescent lights, his gloved hands moving with practiced precision. Other than alcohol, no substances were detected, he later told investigators, his voice heavy with frustration. Cause of death with no concrete evidence is very difficult. The possibility of poisoning lingered in his mind, but without forensic proof, it was just a hunch. Nicky's sister, Anka Hilgert, was at home when the police called. A woman in her late 30s with a cascade of dark hair and a fierce loyalty to her brother. Anka felt the world tilt as the officer's words sank in. "Nicky was careful," she insisted, her voice trembling with grief and disbelief. "He wouldn't just disappear like that." Anka knew her brother's habits, his love for the nightlife, but also his caution. He wasn't reckless, not with drugs or strangers. She pictured him in his market stall, joking with customers, his eyes bright with life. The idea of him lying lifeless in a darkroom felt like a betrayal of everything he was. Weeks earlier, another death had cast a shadow over Berlin. Alexander, a young man in his late 20s with a quiet demeanor and a passion for photography, was found dead in his apartment. His grandmother, Regine Luck, had grown worried when he didn't show up for work. A spry woman in her 70s with a sharp memory, Regine drove to his apartment, her heart heavy with a premonition. She found him lying on his bed, his face pale and still, his phone and wallet gone. The scene was eerily similar to Nicky's, no signs of violence, no clues to suggest foul play. The coroner ruled it an overdose, but Regine wasn't convinced. Alexander wasn't like that, she told the police, her voice firm despite her grief. He had plans, dreams. He mentioned a friend in Saarbrücken, someone he was meeting. Something's not right. Homicide lead investigator Monika Lashka felt a chill as she reviewed the two cases. A tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, Monika had spent years navigating Berlin's underbelly. The city's liberal licensing laws, a legacy of the post-war era, had turned it into a playground for hedonism, but also a hunting ground for those who thrived in chaos. This is the kind of case that made me feel we were dealing with a monster, she later told a documentary crew, her eyes haunted by the memory. The lack of evidence was maddening. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just bodies, stripped of life and possessions, left in the wake of an invisible predator. Monika's team worked out of a cluttered office in Berlin's police headquarters, their desks piled high with case files and coffee cups. The walls were lined with maps of the city, pins marking the locations of the deaths. Friedrichshain, with its maze of clubs and bars, was a focal point. Monika stood before the map, her fingers tracing the streets, her mind racing. Two men, both young, both robbed, both dead under mysterious circumstances, she said to her partner, a grizzled detective named Klaus. This isn't a coincidence. Klaus nodded, his jaw tight. But without evidence, we're chasing ghosts. Then came a breakthrough. On May 5, 2012, Miroslav Wawek woke up in a Berlin hospital, his mind a fog. The 30-year-old had been out the previous night, drawn to the city's nightlife like so many others. He remembered meeting a man at a club, someone with a disarming smile and a quiet intensity. They'd talked, shared a drink, and then nothing. Miroslav woke to the sterile beep of hospital monitors, his credit card and cash gone. Tests revealed a staggering amount of GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, known as liquid ecstasy, in his system. Unlike Nikki and Alexander, Miroslav had survived, but his near-death experience was a beacon in the darkness. Miroslav sat in a hospital bed, his hands trembling as he spoke to Monika. I don't know who he was, he said, his voice shaky but determined. He seemed normal, friendly, but he took everything. Monika listened intently, her notebook filling with details. GHB was a known party drug, but in high doses it was lethal, causing respiratory failure or coma. Its rapid metabolism made it a nightmare for forensic teams, often leaving no trace after a few hours. Miroslav's survival was a miracle, and his story gave Monika hope. You're our key, she told him, her voice steady. You're going to help us stop this. The police traced Miroslav's stolen credit card, which had been used to attempt a train ticket purchase to Saarbrücken. When the card was declined, another card, Nikki's, was used in its place. The connection was undeniable. The same person was behind both incidents. Monika's team pored over CCTV footage from the train station, their eyes straining for a glimpse of the man who had slipped through their fingers. The footage was grainy, the station crowded, but finally they found him, a figure in a distinctive jacket, moving with a quiet confidence that belied his sinister intent. Regine Luck, watching a news report with Alexander's friends, gasped when she saw the footage. That's Alexander's jacket, she said, her voice cutting through the room. The killer had not only taken lives but also trophies, wearing his victims' belongings like a second skin. Regine's tip was a lifeline. She remembered Alexander mentioning a friend in Saarbrücken, a detail that aligned with the credit card activity. Monika's team cross-referenced the footage with club records and witness statements, slowly building a profile of their suspect. The man in the footage was Dirk P., a name that would soon become synonymous with terror. Dirk was an enigma, a man in his 30s with a boyish face and no prior criminal record. He blended seamlessly into Berlin's nightlife, a chameleon who could charm his way into any conversation. Those who knew him described him as quiet, unassuming, almost invisible, a perfect predator. Dirk had moved to Berlin after a falling out with his family, triggered by his accidental coming out as gay in his early adulthood. The rejection had left him bitter, though the exact reason for his descent into murder remained elusive. His first victim, an old friend reconnected through a dating app, had trusted him enough to visit his apartment. There, Dirk laced his drink with a lethal dose of GHB, watching as life drained from his friend's body. The death was ruled an overdose, and Dirk, emboldened, continued his spree. The third victim, Peter, met Dirk in an online chat room. 11 days after Nikki's death, Peter invited Dirk to his apartment, unaware of the danger. Dirk arrived with his glass bottle of knockout drugs, as he later confessed, placing it casually on the table before spiking Peter's drink. Like the others, Peter's body showed no signs of struggle, his phone and wallet missing. The pattern was clear now. Dirk targeted men in Berlin's gay scene, luring them with charm before poisoning them with GHB. The theft of their belongings was an afterthought, a way to fund his next move, or perhaps a twisted keepsake of his crimes. Monika Lashka and her team worked tirelessly, their days blurring into nights. The CCTV footage was their strongest lead, but identifying Dirk was only half the battle. They needed to catch him before he struck again. Berlin's nightlife, with its thousands of clubs and transient crowds, was a labyrinth. Dirk could be anywhere, anyone. The police issued alerts, warning clubgoers to be cautious, but the city's hedonistic pulse didn't slow. People continued to flock to the darkrooms, drawn by the allure of freedom, unaware of the predator in their midst. The investigation gained momentum when Miroslav, piecing together fragments of his memory, recalled the train platform number and time he had traveled. This allowed police to pinpoint the exact CCTV cameras, refining their image of Dirk. The jacket, stolen from Alexander, became a symbol of his arrogance, a clue he hadn't bothered to hide. Monika's team circulated the footage, hoping someone would recognize him. The breakthrough came when a friend of Alexander's confirmed the jacket's origin, linking Dirk to multiple crimes. The police now had a name, a face, and a method. But Dirk was elusive, moving through Berlin like a ghost. As spring turned to summer, the pressure mounted. Berlin's police solved 90% of homicides, but this case was different. The lack of forensic evidence, GHB metabolized quickly, leaving little trace, made it a nightmare to prosecute. Yet, Monika refused to give up. She interviewed bartenders, club owners, and regulars, piecing together Dirk's movements. He was a chameleon, blending into the crowd, his clean record making him invisible to background checks. But his luck was running out. In June 2012, the police closed in. A club employee, wiping down tables at a bar in Kreuzberg, recognized Dirk from the CCTV stills plastered across news outlets. He called the police, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. Monika's team moved swiftly, arresting Dirk as he sat at a corner table, nursing a beer. He didn't resist, his face betraying no emotion as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. In the interrogation room, Monika faced him, her eyes locked on his. Dirk's calm demeanor cracked under her relentless questions. He admitted to the murders, his voice flat, as if recounting a mundane errand. He described lacing drinks with GHB, watching his victims slip away, and taking their belongings. The motive, he claimed, was unclear even to him, a mix of rage, envy, and a desire to control. His confession was chilling, devoid of remorse, as if the lives he took were mere collateral in his private war. The trial, held in June 2013, was a media circus. Berlin's gay community, shaken by the betrayal of one of their own, packed the courtroom. Anka Hilgert, Nikki's sister, spoke of her brother's vibrant spirit, her tears a stark contrast to Dirk's impassive face. "He was my light," she said, her voice breaking. "He made everyone feel seen, loved. How could someone take that away?" Regine Luck, clutching a photo of Alexander, recounted his dreams of becoming a photographer, dreams now buried with him. The prosecution presented the CCTV footage, Miroslav's testimony, and Dirk's confession, painting a picture of a calculated killer. The defense argued that the lack of forensic evidence weakened the case, but the jury was unmoved. Dirk was sentenced to life in prison, a verdict met with somber nods rather than cheers. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. 9 months later, in March 2014, Dirk P. took his own life in his cell. He had attempted suicide multiple times before the trial, but medication had briefly stabilized him. His death brought no closure to the victims' families. Regine Luck sat in her living room, the photo of Alexander still in her hands. "He was a monster, but he was also a man," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I wish I could understand why." Anka, too, struggled with the void left by Nicky's death. "No sentence, no death can bring him back," she said. "I just want to remember him as he was, alive, laughing, free." The darkroom murder case left a lasting mark on Berlin. The city's nightlife, once a symbol of unfettered freedom, took on a cautious edge. Clubs tightened security, installing cameras and training staff to spot suspicious behavior. Patrons became warier, their trust shaken by the knowledge that danger could lurk behind a friendly smile. The dark rooms, once havens, were now tinged with fear, their sanctity violated. Yet, Berlin's spirit endured. The LGBTQ+ community rallied, holding vigils for Nicky, Alexander, and Peter, their names etched into the city's collective memory. Memorials sprang up in Friedrichshain, candles flickering in the night as mourners vowed to reclaim their spaces. Monika Lashka, reflecting on the case years later, spoke of the weight it carried. "We caught him, but it doesn't erase the loss," she said, her voice heavy with the burden of her work. "Every case changes you, but this one, it was like chasing a ghost in a city that never sleeps." The Netflix docuseries Crime Scene Berlin, Nightlife Killer, released in April 2024, brought the case to a global audience. Its 3 episodes wove together interviews with Monika, Miroslav, and the victims' families, offering a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the cost of freedom. The series, produced by filmmaker Joe Berlinger, captured the tension of the investigation and the resilience of a community that refused to be broken. The story of the darkroom murderer is not just a tale of crime and punishment, but of a city and its people navigating the delicate balance between liberation and danger. Berlin, with its endless nights and open hearts, would heal, but the memory of those lost, Nicky, Alexander, Peter, and the survivor, Miroslav, would linger. Their stories, etched into the city's soul, served as a quiet reminder of the darkness that can hide in the brightest of places and the strength it takes to carry on. Story 6. The sun hung low over Kwamashu, a township pulsing with life on the outskirts of Durban, South Africa. It was August 16, 2024, and the air carried the familiar hum of daily routines. Vendors calling out at the market, children laughing in the streets, and the rhythmic clatter of minibus taxis weaving through the dusty roads. In the K section, a modest home stood quietly amidst the bustle, its walls weathered but warm with the love of the Radebe family. Inside, 19-year-old Owami Radebe, known to everyone as Kurub, moved through the morning with a restlessness that his mother, Nonlanla, had come to recognize. His eyes, usually bright with a mix of mischief and warmth, were clouded today, his shoulders tense as he argued over something trivial, a spilled cup of tea, a mislaid pair of shoes. It was one of those days, Nonlanla thought, when Kurub's struggles with schizophrenia and ADHD seemed to weigh heavier than usual. Kurub was no stranger to the community. His lanky frame, quick smile, and unpredictable energy made him a familiar figure at Kwamashu Station, where he often earned a few rands washing cars or helping vendors pack their wares. "He's a fighter and a lover at the same time," Nonlanla would later say, her voice breaking as she recalled her son's duality. He could be fierce one moment, squaring up to anyone who crossed him, only to laugh it off the next, sharing a joke with the same person he'd clashed with. The people of Kwamashu knew him, loved him, even when his moods swung like a pendulum. But that morning, something felt different. As Kurub stormed out of the house, his grandmother, Nokuthala, watched him go, her heart heavy with a quiet unease. He'd left before, sometimes wandering to Pietermaritzburg to see his father, or to Umlatsi for a day or two, but he always came back. Always. By midday Kurub returned, his temper cooled. He greeted his family with a nod, asked to bathe, and changed into a black jean and a powder blue shirt that seemed to lift his spirits. Nokuthela noticed the small carrier bag he clutched as he left again, waving to neighbors at around 1 p.m. The bag swung lightly in his hand, a detail that would later haunt her, such a small thing, yet it was the last image she had of her grandson. The neighbors saw him too, his familiar stride cutting through the crowded streets toward Kwamashu Station. Then, like a shadow swallowed by the sun, Owami Kurub Radebe vanished. The hours that followed were unremarkable at first. Nanlanla busied herself with chores, expecting Kurub to return by evening, as he often did. But when the sky darkened and the house grew quiet, a knot of worry tightened in her chest. She called his name at the gate, her voice echoing into the night. No answer. By morning, the worry had morphed into fear. Nanlanla and Nokuthela began phoning friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen him. They checked his usual haunts, the station, the market, the corners where he'd linger with friends. Nothing. It was as if the township, so full of eyes and ears, had gone blind and deaf to Kurub's presence. The Radebe family's search began in earnest, a desperate quest fueled by love and dread. Nanlanla, a woman whose strength had carried her through years of hardship, felt her resolve tested as she knocked on doors and scoured the streets. Nokuthela, her face etched with lines of worry, joined her, their footsteps tracing a map of Kwamashu's sprawling lanes. They went to the police, filing a missing person report with the South African Police Service, SAPS. But the officers seemed overwhelmed, their desks piled high with cases. "We'll look into it," one said, his tone flat, offering little comfort. The family didn't wait. They spread word through the community, their pleas amplified by Izathunywa Zokugsana, Missing Persons South Africa, a grassroots organization dedicated to finding the lost. Flyers went up on lamp posts and shop windows, Kurub's face staring out from grainy photos, his powder blue shirt a beacon in their minds. Days turned into weeks, and the search grew more frantic. The family combed Durban city center, checked hospitals, peered into mortuaries with bated breath, and even searched under bridges, where the homeless sometimes gathered. Each dead end was a fresh wound. False leads poured in, sightings that weren't him, rumors that he'd been seen in Umlatsi, or even as far as Johannesburg. The cruelest blow came when strangers arrived at the Radebe home, offering condolences for a death that hadn't been confirmed. They said he was found deceased, Nanlanla recalled, her voice trembling. Some even offered funeral assistance. It was traumatizing. The family clung to hope, but it was a fragile thing, fraying with each passing day. The community rallied, as Kwamashu communities do. Neighbors joined the search, volunteers distributed flyers, and local vendors kept an eye out at the station. But the absence of answers gnawed at everyone. Kurub, with his larger-than-life presence, couldn't have just vanished. Could he? The family's frustration with the police grew. "The police are failing us," Nokuthela said, her voice sharp with anger. They appealed to higher authorities, naming Minister Sentsom Chinu and General Mlanlam Kwanazi in their pleas, hoping for resources, for manpower, for anything that might bring Kurub home. The silence from official channels was deafening. As August gave way to September, the Radebe home became a place of restless vigil. Nanlanla couldn't sleep, her nights filled with visions of Kurub, laughing, arguing, alive. She spoke to him through her tears, as if her words could reach him wherever he was. "Owami, Kurub, we miss you," she whispered into the empty house. "This house is empty without you. Please come home." Nokuthela, too, carried her grief like a weight, her prayers a constant murmur. The family's story spread, carried by social media hashtags, #FindOwami, #BringOwamiHome, that lit up screens across South Africa. Izathunywa Zokugsana posted updates, urging anyone with information to come forward, promising anonymity. Contact numbers were shared. Every call was a flicker of hope, every silence a fresh despair. By January 2025, 5 months had passed, and the case remained unsolved. The Radebe family's search had taken them across Durban, from the bustling taxi ranks to the quiet beaches where the Indian Ocean whispered secrets it wouldn't share. They had faced the unbearable, examining decomposed bodies in morgues, each time praying it wasn't their Kurub. The hardest part is wondering if it's your child, Nokuthula said, her voice hollow. The community's support never wavered, but the lack of progress was a heavy burden. The family's plea was simple yet desperate. We just want closure, even if it's painful. We need to know what happened to our son. Theories began to swirl, though none could be confirmed. Had Kurub's mental health struggles led him somewhere dangerous? Had he been taken, caught up in the underbelly of crime that sometimes shadowed Kwamashu? Or had he simply wandered too far, lost in a world that couldn't find him? The police offered no answers, their resources stretched thin in a country grappling with high crime rates. South Africa's missing persons cases often went unresolved, a grim reality that the Radibis were now living. Yet they refused to give up. "We will never stop searching," Nanlanla vowed, her voice steady despite the tears. The case of Owami Kurub, Radibi's disappearance, is not just a story of loss, but a testament to a family's unbreakable spirit. It is a story of a community that refused to forget, of a township that held its breath, waiting for one of its own to come home. It is a story of a mother's love, fierce and unyielding, and a grandmother's faith, steadfast in the face of uncertainty. Above all, it is a story that demands to be told, to be shared, to be amplified until answers are found. For the Radibis, for Kwamashu, for Kurub, the search continues. Story 7. The winter of 2019 in Berlin was unforgiving, the kind of cold that settled into the bones and lingered like an unwelcome guest. In the working-class neighborhood of Britz, nestled within the sprawling borough of Neukölln, life moved to the rhythm of routine. Children trudging to school, parents hurrying to work, the hum of traffic blending with the distant clatter of trams. But on the morning of February 18th, 2019, that rhythm faltered. A 15-year-old girl named Rebecca Reusch, known to her family as Betchy, vanished from her sister's home, leaving behind a void that would haunt her family, captivate a nation, and unravel a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Rebecca was a vibrant teenager, her life a mosaic of dreams and youthful passions. Born on September 21st, 2003, she grew up in a close-knit family, the youngest of 3 sisters. Her parents, Bridget and Bernd Reusch, lived in a modest home in Britz, a neighborhood marked by its mix of concrete apartment blocks and quiet streets. Rebecca was a 10th grader at the Walter Gropius Schule in nearby Gropiusstad, a place where she was known for her bright smile and her love of K-pop, particularly the Korean boy band BTS. Her Instagram account, with over 30,000 followers, was a gallery of filtered selfies and glimpses into her world. A world filled with music, fashion, and the hope of becoming a model or a flight attendant. But beneath the surface, Rebecca was a typical teenager, navigating the complexities of adolescence in a city that was both vibrant and unforgiving. On the evening of February 17th, 2019, Rebecca asked her parents if she could spend the night at her eldest sister Jessica's house, just a short walk away in the southern part of Britz. Jessica, 27, lived with her husband, Florian, and their young daughter in a small house on Moreweg, a quiet street lined with unassuming homes. The sisters were close, and Rebecca often spent weekends at Jessica's, sharing laughter and late-night movie marathons. That Sunday, Florian was out at a work party, leaving the sisters to enjoy a girls' night in. Rebecca's mother agreed, but only on the condition that Rebecca would make it to school on time the next morning, a Monday with a late start due to an unscheduled schedule change. As the sun set over Berlin, Rebecca and Jessica settled into the cozy living room, the glow of the television casting shadows on the walls. They watched movies, chatted about music, and savored the simple joy of sisterhood. Rebecca, dressed in her favorite BTS hoodie, a pink plush jacket, ripped jeans, and black and white Vans sneakers, curled up on the couch where she planned to sleep. Jessica retired to her bedroom upstairs, her daughter tucked in beside her, leaving Rebecca to drift off in the quiet of the living room. Outside, the neighborhood was still, the only sounds the occasional car passing by and the distant bark of a dog. At 5:45 a.m., Florian returned home from the party, his footsteps heavy from a long night. He slipped into the house, careful not to wake his daughter or Rebecca, and headed straight to bed. The house settled back into silence, the world outside still dark. At 7 a.m., Jessica rose, bundling her daughter into warm clothes for the trip to daycare. She didn't check on Rebecca, assuming her sister was still asleep on the couch, and left the house quietly, locking the door behind her. In that moment, only two people remained in the house, Rebecca and Florian. It was a detail that would soon become the fulcrum of a case that gripped Germany. By 7:15 a.m., Brigitte Reusch was already up, her maternal instincts nudging her to check on her daughter. She dialed Rebecca's number, expecting to hear her sleepy voice promising to get ready for school. But the call went straight to voicemail. Brigitte frowned, assuming the phone was off or out of battery, and tried again at 8:25 a.m. Again voicemail. A flicker of unease stirred in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Rebecca was probably just running late. She called Jessica, who confirmed she'd left for work and daycare, then Florian, who answered groggily. He told Brigitte that Rebecca must have already left for school, as she wasn't in the house. The words struck Brigitte as odd. School didn't start until 9:50 a.m., and it was unlike Rebecca to leave so early, especially without her phone. At 8:42 a.m., Brigitte sent a WhatsApp message to Rebecca, a simple reminder to get to school. The message was delivered but never read, a detail that would later haunt her. By mid-morning, when the school called to report that Rebecca hadn't shown up, the unease turned to panic. Brigitte and Bernd drove to Jessica's house, their hearts pounding, hoping to find their daughter safe. But the house was empty, the couch where Rebecca had slept neatly made. Her belongings, her Vans backpack, pink handbag, purse with the initials MK, mobile phone, and pink Fuji Instax Mini 9 camera, were gone. So was a purple blanket from the household, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later fuel speculation. By the afternoon of February 18th, the Reusch family was in a state of desperation. They reported Rebecca missing to the Berlin police, who launched an immediate investigation. The case quickly escalated, and by February 21st, Rebecca was officially declared missing. 2 days later, the homicide squad took over, a move that signaled the police's growing suspicion that this was no ordinary disappearance. Rebecca's phone data showed it had last connected to the home's Wi-Fi at 7:46 a.m., and a Snapchat photo she sent to a friend sometime between 7 o'clock and 7:46 a.m. showed her standing in a corridor, dressed in her BTS hoodie and jeans. The photo, seen by her friend at 8:15 a.m., was the last confirmed trace of Rebecca alive. The police turned their attention to the house on Moorweg, where the last known moments of Rebecca's life had unfolded. Florian, the only person known to be with her that morning, became the focus of their scrutiny. He was arrested on February 28th, just 10 days after Rebecca's disappearance, based on inconsistencies in his story. He claimed he'd slept through the morning after returning from the party, but router data showed he'd been active online, visiting websites that included disturbing content involving bondage and strangulation. More damning, traffic cameras captured his car on the A12 motorway toward Poland at 10:45 a.m. on February 18th, and again on the evening of February 19th. When questioned, Florian offered a vague explanation, claiming the trips were related to a drug deal, but he refused to elaborate. He was released on March 1st, arrested again on March 4th, and released again on March 22nd, as police lacked sufficient evidence to hold him. The case exploded into the public consciousness, drawing comparisons to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann for its mystery and media frenzy. On March 6, 2019, the German television featured the case, with lead investigator Michael Hoffman appealing for witnesses. He revealed Florian's motorway trips and showed his mugshots, a move criticized by Florian's lawyers as prejudicial. The broadcast generated over 300 tips, and by April 2023, police had received over 3,000 leads, yet none led to Rebecca. Forests and lakes near the A12 were searched, and in September 2019, a woodland area near Kummersdorf was scoured, but no trace of Rebecca or her belongings was found. The Reusch family, meanwhile, was caught in a maelstrom of grief and suspicion. Bridget and Bernd clung to the hope that Rebecca was alive, possibly abducted and held somewhere. They criticized the police for using a heavily filtered Instagram photo in early searches, arguing it didn't resemble their daughter. Bridget, in interviews, spoke of her daughter's dreams, her love for BTS, and her vibrant spirit. But the family's defense of Florian, their son-in-law, drew scrutiny. Jessica, fiercely loyal to her husband, insisted he was innocent, and the family's public statements often focused on his exoneration rather than Rebecca's fate. This stance fueled public speculation, with some online communities comparing Jessica to controversial figures like Casey Anthony, questioning her demeanor and motives. As the investigation deepened, new details emerged, each adding layers to the mystery. Fibers from a pink blanket, similar to one missing from Jessica's house, were found in the trunk of Florian's car, along with hairs that raised suspicions but couldn't be conclusively linked to Rebecca. A bathrobe belt was reported missing from the house, prompting theories about its use in a crime, though the family offered explanations for its absence. In 2021, a police insider revealed a critical oversight. Investigators had delayed requesting Google data on Rebecca's phone location, a misstep that may have cost crucial evidence. By the time the data was obtained, it offered no new leads. The 5th anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance brought renewed attention, with reports of a video showing a figure near a Brandenburg cabin and whispers of police mishandling. Yet, despite these developments, the case remained stubbornly unresolved. The Berlin police, now treating it as a homicide, believed Rebecca never left the house alive, but without a body or definitive evidence, Florian remained free. For the Reusch family, the years since 2019 have been a slow bleed of hope. Bridget and Bernd continued their search, posting emotional appeals on social media, their voices trembling with a mother's and father's desperation. Jessica and Florian welcomed another child, a decision that sparked public outrage among those who viewed Florian as the prime suspect. The neighborhood of Brits, once a backdrop to Rebecca's vibrant life, became a place of whispers and suspicion, the house on Moorweg a silent monument to a girl who vanished without a trace. The case of Rebecca Reusch is a wound that refuses to heal, a mystery that gnaws at the edges of reason. It is a story of a family torn apart by loss, a community divided by doubt, and a city haunted by the question of what happened to a 15-year-old girl who loved K-pop and dreamed of soaring above the clouds. Was she betrayed by someone she trusted, or did she cross paths with a stranger in those fleeting morning hours? The truth remains elusive, buried somewhere in the shadows of that cold February morning, waiting for the day it might finally come to light. Story 8. The spring of 1968 bloomed over Georgetown, Kentucky, with the kind of deceptive calm that masks darker truths. Wildflowers dotted the rolling hills along U.S. Route 25, their delicate petals swaying in the breeze, oblivious to the secrets the earth held. On May 17th, a man named Wilbur Riddle trudged through the underbrush, his boots crunching against the gravelly shoulder of the highway. A scavenger by habit, he was hunting for glass insulators, those colorful relics of old telephone lines that collectors prized. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the landscape, when something caught his eye, a bundle, oddly out of place, wrapped in a heavy green canvas tarpaulin. It looked like the kind of material used to bundle a tent, sturdy and weathered, tied tightly with rope. Curiosity tugged at him, but as he approached, a faint, sour odor wrinkled his nose. His heart quickened. He knelt, tugged at the canvas, and froze. What lay inside was no discarded camping gear. It was a body, decomposing, human, and unmistakably female. Wilbur stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The world seemed to tilt, the wildflowers and chirping birds suddenly alien in their indifference. He didn't linger. He ran to the nearest phone, his hands trembling as he dialed the Scott County Sheriff's Office. Within hours, deputies swarmed the scene, cordoning off the patch of earth where the body lay. The canvas was carefully peeled back, revealing a young woman, her reddish-brown hair matted against her skull, her frame slight, barely 5 feet 1 inch, weighing no more than 115 pounds. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for weeks, perhaps since late April or early May. There were no identification papers, no purse, no jewelry to hint at who she was. The only clue was the canvas itself, a coarse, utilitarian shroud that gave her the name she'd carried for decades, the Tent Girl. The discovery sent ripples through Georgetown, a small town where violent crime was rare. The sheriff's office launched an investigation, but the trail was cold from the start. The woman's body bore no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab marks, but the circumstances screamed foul play. Who wrapped her in that tarp? Why was she left on a lonely stretch of highway? Deputies canvassed the area, questioning locals, but no one recalled seeing anything unusual. Missing persons reports from Kentucky and beyond were scoured, but none matched the description of the petite young woman with reddish-brown hair. A police artist sketched her face, a haunting approximation of what she might have looked like alive, with wide eyes and a slight gap between her front teeth. The sketch was plastered in newspapers and on bulletin boards, but no one came forward to claim her. In 1971, with no leads and no identity, the town laid her to rest in Georgetown Cemetery. A local company donated a headstone, etched with the words, "Tent Girl." Found May 17, 1968 on U.S. Highway 25, N. Died about April 26 to May 3, 1968. Age about 16 to 19 years. Height 5 feet 1 inch. Weight 110 to 115 pounds. Reddish-brown hair. Unidentified. Beside the inscription was an engraving of the police sketch, a ghostly reminder of a life lost and a mystery unsolved. The townsfolk mourned her, not as a neighbor or friend, but as a symbol of something fragile and broken. Yet, as years turned to decades, the Tent Girl faded into local lore, a sad footnote in Georgetown's history. In East St. Louis, Illinois, 25 years earlier, a girl named Barbara Ann Hackman was born on September 12, 1943. The Hackman family was close-knit, anchored by Harry and Louise, who raised Barbara and her 3 sisters, Rosemary, Jan, and Marie, in a modest home filled with the hum of daily life. Barbara, or Bobby as her family called her, was a bright spark, small in stature but big in personality. Her reddish-brown hair framed a face that carried a quiet determination, and her smile, with its distinctive gap between her front teeth, was quick and warm. She was the kind of girl who dreamed beyond the confines of her working-class roots, her eyes often drifting to the horizon as if searching for something more. By her teens, Bobby's life took a turn that would set her on a path toward tragedy. In the early 1960s, while still a teenager, she met George Earl Taylor, a man whose charm masked a restless, unstable core. George was older, a carnival worker from Florida with a weathered face and a past he didn't share easily. He was a single father, claiming his first wife had left him for another man, leaving him to raise his young daughter alone. Bobby, barely out of high school, was drawn to his stories of life on the road, the bright lights of the carnival, the promise of adventure. To her family, the match seemed hasty, but Bobby was in love, or at least, in love with the idea of escape. They married quickly, and soon after, Bobby gave birth to a daughter, a bright-eyed girl who became the center of her world. The young family settled in Lexington, Kentucky, about 15 miles from Georgetown. Life wasn't easy. George's work with the carnival kept him away for long stretches, leaving Bobby to care for their daughter in a small apartment that felt more like a way station than a home. Money was tight, and George's temper could flare unpredictably, casting shadows over their marriage. Bobby's sisters, especially Rosemary, noticed the strain in her letters and phone calls. She spoke less of adventure and more of exhaustion, her voice tinged with a quiet resignation. Still, she doted on her daughter, who was 8 months old by the fall of 1967, and clung to the hope that things would get better. Then, in December 1967, Bobby vanished. George told her family she'd left him, run off with another man, abandoning her daughter without a word. The story didn't sit right with the Hackmans. Bobby was devoted to her child. She'd never leave her behind. But George was adamant, and with no missing person report filed, the police spots had little to go on. The Hackmans, scattered across states, searched as best they could, calling hospitals, checking with friends, but Bobby was gone, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her sisters held on to hope, but as months turned to years, that hope grew brittle, a fragile thread stretched across an abyss of uncertainty. Back in Georgetown, the Tent Girl's case grew colder with each passing year. The sheriff's office kept her file open, but without new evidence, it was relegated to a drawer, a nagging reminder of failure. The headstone in the cemetery became a pilgrimage site for a few curious souls, but most moved on, their lives untouched by the mystery. That is, until a young man named Todd Matthews entered the story. Todd was an unlikely hero, a factory worker from Livingston, Tennessee, with no formal training in investigation. In the late 1980s, he married Lori Riddle, the daughter of Wilbur Riddle, the man who'd found the Tent Girl's body. Wilbur, now an older man, carried the weight of that day like a stone in his chest. He'd tell the story late at night, his voice low, describing the tarp, the smell, the way the world seemed to hush around the discovery. Todd listened, captivated, not just by the mystery but by the human tragedy of it. A young woman, unnamed, unclaimed, her story unfinished. Todd's obsession grew. In an era before the internet, he pored over newspaper clippings, called police departments, and wrote letters to anyone who might have information. When the internet emerged in the mid-1990s, it was a revelation. Missing persons databases, rudimentary but growing, offered a new way to connect dots. Todd spent nights hunched over his computer, scrolling through reports of missing women, comparing descriptions to the Tent Girl's profile. 5 feet 110 to 115 pounds, reddish-brown hair, age estimated at 16 to 19. The age was a problem. Bobby was 24 when she disappeared, but coroners often underestimated ages in unidentified cases, and Todd wasn't deterred. In 1997, he launched a website dedicated to the Tent Girl, a digital beacon for anyone who might know something. He posted the police sketch, the details of her discovery, and a plea for information. The site was simple, built with the clunky tools of early web design, but it was a labor of love. Todd's wife, Lori, supported him, though she sometimes worried about the toll it took. He'd stay up until dawn, his eyes red from the screen, driven by a need to give the Tent Girl her name. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, Rosemary Westbrook, Bobby's sister, was doing her own searching. The Hackman family had never accepted George's story about Bobby running off. Rosemary, now in her 40s, had taken to the internet, posting about her missing sister on nascent missing persons forums. She described Bobby's reddish-brown hair, her slight build, the gap in her teeth, and the fact that she'd disappeared from Lexington in late 1967. The post was a long shot, a message in a bottle tossed into the digital sea. In early 1998, Todd stumbled across Rosemary's post. His heart raced as he read the description. The details aligned too closely to be coincidence. The location, the physical characteristics, the timing. He emailed Rosemary, his message cautious but hopeful, outlining the Tent Girl case and asking if Bobby could be a match. Rosemary's reply came quickly, her words trembling with possibility. She'd always believed Bobby was out there, somewhere, and the idea that she might have been the Tent Girl both horrified and galvanized her. The Scott County Sheriff's Office was skeptical but intrigued. They'd long since exhausted their leads, but Todd's persistence and Rosemary's certainty prompted action. In April 1998, they exhumed the Tent Girl's remains from Georgetown Cemetery. The process was grim, the coffin lifted from the earth under the watchful eyes of deputies and forensic experts. DNA technology, still in its infancy, was their best hope. Samples from the remains were compared to DNA from Bobby's sisters. Days turned to weeks, the waiting agonizing for both the Hackmans and Todd. Then, on April 23, 1998, the sheriff's office announced the result. The Tent Girl was Barbara and Hackman Taylor. The identification was a bittersweet triumph. For the Hackmans, it confirmed their worst fears. Bobby had been murdered, her body discarded like refuse. For Todd, it was validation of years of work, but also a sobering reminder of the crime's brutality. The sheriff's office turned its attention to George Earl Taylor, Bobby's husband, who died of cancer in 1987. He'd been a carnival worker, a drifter whose life was as transient as the fairs he worked. His story about Bobby leaving him for another man now seemed like a flimsy lie, and his failure to report her missing pointed to guilt. Investigators believed he was the prime suspect, but with him dead, justice was out of reach. The case remained officially unsolved, a wound that wouldn't fully heal. The Hackmans reburied Bobby in Georgetown Cemetery, under the original headstone, but with a new base added. It read, Barbara and Bobby Hackman. September 12, 1943 C. December 6, 1967. Loving mother, grandmother, and sister. They omitted George's surname, a quiet act of defiance against the man they believed took her life. Bobby's daughter, now grown and living in Ohio with her own family, learned of her mother's fate. She'd been too young to remember Bobby, but the knowledge that her mother hadn't abandoned her brought a fragile sense of closure. Todd Matthews, forever changed by the case, co-founded the Doe Network, a volunteer organization dedicated to matching missing persons with unidentified remains. The Tent Girl case became a touchstone, proof that persistence and technology could solve even the coldest mysteries. The story of Bobby Hackman Taylor spread beyond Georgetown, covered in true crime shows like Who Killed Jane Doe, and podcasts like Crime Junkie and My Favorite Murder. Each retelling honored Bobby's memory, but also underscored the tragedy. A young mother, full of dreams, silenced too soon. The years passed, and Georgetown's wildflowers continued to bloom along U.S. Route 25. The highway stretched on, indifferent to the lives it intersected. Bobby's story, though, lingered in the hearts of those who knew it. Her sisters visited her grave, leaving flowers and whispering prayers. Todd Matthews continued his work, driven by the memory of the Tent Girl and the countless others still waiting for their names. And in the quiet of the cemetery, Bobby's headstone stood as a testament to a life reclaimed, a mystery solved, and a family's enduring love. Story 9. The morning of May 28, 2019, dawned crisp and clear in Kawasaki City, a bustling urban sprawl just outside Tokyo's frenetic heart. The Tama Ward, with its quiet residential streets and neatly trimmed hedges, hummed with the gentle rhythm of routine. School children in pressed uniforms gathered at bus stops, their laughter mingling with the chirping of sparrows. Parents sipped coffee in nearby homes, preparing for the day's demands, while the city's pulse beat steadily, unassuming and familiar. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a darkness was stirring, one that would shatter the lives of many in a matter of minutes. At the center of this tragedy was Ryuichi Iwasaki, a 51-year-old man whose name would soon be etched into Japan's collective memory. Iwasaki was not a figure who commanded attention in life. He was a recluse, a man who had withdrawn from the world, living in the shadows of his elderly aunt and uncle's home in Kawasaki's Aseo Ward. To neighbors, he was a fleeting presence, a man who rarely spoke, whose existence seemed to blur into the background of their daily lives. But on that fateful morning, Iwasaki stepped out of the shadows, carrying with him a plan so horrific it would leave a nation reeling. The bus stop near Noburito Park was a familiar gathering point for students of Caritas Gakuen, a Catholic elementary school founded by the Sœurs de la Charite de Quebec. The children, mostly girls, stood in orderly lines, their school bags slung over their shoulders, chatting about homework and weekend plans. Among them was 11-year-old Hanako Muraoka, a bright-eyed girl with a penchant for drawing and a laugh that could light up a room. Nearby, 39-year-old Satoshi Umatsu, a foreign ministry official and devoted father, stood watchfully, ensuring the children boarded the bus safely. The scene was mundane, a snapshot of everyday life in a city where safety was taken for granted. But at 7:44 a.m., the tranquility was shattered. Iwasaki emerged from the morning mist, his face a mask of grim determination. In each hand, he clutched a Yanagiba knife, its long, thin blade glinting in the early sunlight. These were no ordinary kitchen tools. They were specialized blades, crafted for precision in preparing sashimi, their edges honed to a razor's sharpness. Witnesses would later recall the chilling sight of Iwasaki striding toward the bus stop, his voice cutting through the air with a guttural scream. "I will kill you!" The children froze, their chatter silenced as Iwasaki lunged forward. Chaos erupted in an instant. The sharp crack of screams filled the air as the blades found their marks, slashing through the morning's calm with ruthless efficiency. Hanako Muraoka, standing near the front of the line, was among the first to fall, her small frame crumpling to the ground as blood stained her white uniform. Satoshi Uematsu, reacting instinctively, threw himself between the attacker and the children, but he too was struck down, his life extinguished in a futile act of heroism. The other students scattered, some collapsing under the weight of their injuries, others running blindly, their school bags abandoned in the dirt. A bus driver, parked nearby, watched in horror as the scene unfolded. He saw Iwasaki's deliberate movements, the way he wielded the knives with a terrifying purpose. The driver fumbled for his phone, dialing emergency services as children screamed for help. Blood pooled on the pavement, soaking into scattered books and backpacks, a stark contrast to the bright spring morning. Within minutes, Iwasaki turned the blade on himself, driving it into his own neck with the same cold precision. He collapsed, his body lying motionless beside his victims, as sirens began to wail in the distance. The Kawasaki City Fire Department responded swiftly, arriving to a scene of unimaginable carnage. Paramedics worked frantically, triaging the wounded as police secured the area. 2 sashimi knives, their blades slick with blood, were found near Iwasaki's body, and a backpack at a nearby Family Mart yielded 2 more, a 25-centimeter all-purpose knife and a 20-centimeter bocho. The toll was devastating. Hanako Muraoka and Satoshi Uematsu were dead, and 18 others, mostly schoolgirls, were injured, 3 of them critically. The community, known for its quiet safety, was plunged into grief and disbelief. As news of the attack spread, reporters descended on Kawasaki, their cameras capturing the grim aftermath. The bus stop, once a place of routine farewells, was now cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded. Parents rushed to the scene, their faces etched with panic as they searched for their children. At Caritas Gakuen, teachers huddled with students, trying to shield them from the news while grappling with their own shock. The city, and soon the nation, was left to grapple with a single question. Who was Ryuichi Iwasaki, and what drove him to commit such an unspeakable act? Ryuichi Iwasaki's life was a study in isolation. Born in 1968, he grew up in Kawasaki, a city that thrived on its proximity to Tokyo's economic engine. Little is known about his early years, but glimpses from those who knew him paint a picture of a man who never quite found his place in the world. His junior high school graduation album, later uncovered by police, showed a young Iwasaki with a shy smile, unremarkable among his peers. But as he moved into adulthood, he began to withdraw, retreating into a solitude that would define his existence. Iwasaki was what the Japanese call a hikikomori, a term for those who shun social contact and live in extreme seclusion. By his 50s, he was unemployed, living in a small room in his elderly aunt and uncle's home in Aseo Ward, about 4 kilometers from the site of the attack. His relatives, both in their 80s, were his primary connection to the outside world, but even that bond was strained. Neighbors described Iwasaki as a troublemaker, recalling an incident a year earlier when he had angrily confronted a couple over a tree branch that had brushed against him. He rang their doorbell repeatedly, shouting accusations, his voice laced with a rage that seemed disproportionate to the offense. Kawasaki welfare officials had been in contact with Iwasaki's aunt and uncle since 2017, concerned about his reclusive behavior and their advancing age. The couple worried about what would become of Ryuichi when they could no longer care for him. They tried to engage him, leaving letters outside his room, urging him to take steps toward independence. In one response, Iwasaki bristled at the label of hikikomori, insisting he was self-sufficient, cooking and cleaning for himself. But his words belied a deeper truth. Iwasaki was a man adrift, disconnected from society, his inner world a mystery even to those closest to him. Criminal psychologist Professor Takayuki Harada, who later analyzed the case, suggested that Iwasaki's attack was not a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of a meticulously planned act. The purchase of the knives, for in total, each chosen for its lethal potential, pointed to a deliberate intent to kill. Harada posited that Iwasaki's actions were a form of extended suicide, a warped desire to end his own life while making a final, devastating statement to the world. He wanted to be noticed, Harada said, to force the world to pay attention to him, even if it meant destroying lives in the process. The police raid on Iwasaki's home revealed little about his motivations. His room was sparse, a reflection of his insular existence. A futon, a few personal items, and no trace of a manifesto or diary that might explain his actions. His aunt and uncle, devastated by the news, could offer no insight into what had driven him to such violence. They spoke of a man who had become increasingly distant, his interactions limited to curt exchanges. The knives, it seemed, were the only clues to his state of mind, their cold steel a silent testament to the darkness that had consumed him. In the days following the attack, Kawasaki City became a place of mourning and reflection. Vigils sprang up near Noborito Park, where flowers and handwritten notes piled high in memory of Hanako Muraoka and Satoshi Uematsu. Hanako's parents, Hiroshi and Yoko, were inconsolable, their grief compounded by the public nature of their loss. Hanako had been their only child, a girl whose drawings of flowers and animals still adorned their refrigerator. Her father, a quiet man who worked as an accountant, stood before reporters, his voice trembling as he spoke of her kindness and creativity. "She was our light," he said, "and now that light is gone." Satoshi Uematsu's death struck a different chord. A career diplomat, he had spent years representing Japan abroad, his life dedicated to public service. His colleagues at the Foreign Ministry described him as a man of integrity, someone who took his responsibilities seriously, both at work and as a father. His wife, Aiko, and their 2 young children were left to navigate a world without him, their grief mirrored by a nation that hailed him as a hero. At his funeral, held in a small temple in Kawasaki, mourners spoke of his courage, of how he had given his life to protect the children. The 18 injured students, many of whom bore physical and emotional scars, faced a long road to recovery. Some required multiple surgeries, their young bodies marked by wounds that would serve as lifelong reminders of that morning. Parents organized support groups, meeting in community centers to share their pain and advocate for better mental health resources. The attack had exposed a fault line in Japanese society, one that ran through its treatment of the socially isolated and the mentally unwell. The term hikikomori became a focal point of national debate. In Japan, an estimated 1.15 million people, mostly men, live as recluses, retreating from social and economic pressures into lives of solitude. The phenomenon, rooted in cultural expectations of conformity and success, had long been a source of concern, but Iwasaki's actions brought it into sharp focus. Media outlets ran stories on the hikikomori crisis, interviewing experts like Morito Ishizaki, a journalist who cautioned against conflating social withdrawal with violence. To think otherwise encourages discrimination, Ishizaki warned, and makes things worse for those who are already struggling. Yet the public's fear was palpable. Iwasaki's attack was not an isolated incident. It echoed other acts of violence in Japan's recent history, from the 2016 Sagamihara stabbings to the 2017 Twitter killer case. Each had raised questions about the country's ability to address mental health and social isolation. In Kawasaki, residents demanded answers. How had Iwasaki slipped through the cracks? Why had welfare officials, aware of his reclusive tendencies, not intervened more decisively? The city's mayor, Norihiko Fukuda, faced intense scrutiny, promising a review of social services, but offering little in the way of concrete solutions. The investigation into Iwasaki's motives was frustratingly inconclusive. With no surviving suspect to interrogate, police relied on physical evidence and witness accounts to piece together the events of May 28th. The knives, purchased in the weeks leading up to the attack, suggested premeditation, but no clear trigger emerged. Iwasaki had no criminal record, no history of mental health treatment, and no apparent connection to his victims. The children of Caritas Gakuen were strangers to him, their innocence a stark contrast to the rage that drove his actions. Speculation swirled in the media. Some pointed to Iwasaki's unemployment and social isolation as factors, suggesting that years of disconnection had festered into resentment. Others, like Professor Harada, saw the attack as a cry for attention, a desperate act by a man who felt invisible. The concept of extended suicide gained traction, with experts noting that such acts often involve a desire to inflict pain on others as a means of asserting control over one's own narrative. But without Iwasaki's own words, these theories remained just that, theories, unable to fully explain the horror he had unleashed. The legal aftermath was limited by Iwasaki's death. With no suspect to prosecute, the case was closed swiftly, leaving families and survivors to seek justice through other means. Some parents filed civil lawsuits against the city, arguing that welfare officials had failed to act on warning signs. These suits, though, were largely symbolic. No amount of compensation could undo the damage. The focus shifted to prevention, with calls for better mental health support and early intervention for hikikomori. The government allocated funds for community outreach programs, but critics argued that these measures were too little, too late. The Kawasaki stabbings left an indelible mark on Japan. In the years that followed, the bus stop near Noburito Park became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a site where people left flowers and prayers for those lost and injured. Caritas Gakuen, though shaken, continued its mission, its students returning to class with a resilience born of necessity. Hanako Muraoka's parents established a scholarship in her name, supporting young artists in the hope that her love for creativity would live on. Satoshi Uematsu was posthumously honored by the foreign ministry, his sacrifice a reminder of the courage found in ordinary moments. For the survivors, the scars were both visible and invisible. Some spoke of nightmares, of the sound of Iwasaki's voice echoing in their dreams. Others found solace in community, leaning on one another to navigate their trauma. The parents of the injured formed a tight-knit network, advocating for policy changes and raising awareness about the needs of hikikomori. Their efforts bore fruit in small ways. New counseling programs, community centers dedicated to mental health, and a growing willingness to talk openly about isolation and its consequences. Ryuichi Iwasaki's name faded from headlines, but his actions lingered in the national consciousness. He became a symbol of a hidden crisis, a man whose descent into darkness exposed the fragility of a society that prided itself on order and harmony. The question of why he acted as he did remained unanswered, a void that no investigation could fill. Perhaps that was the true tragedy of the Kawasaki stabbings, not just the lives lost, but the mystery of a man who chose to end his own in a way that caused so much pain. As Kawasaki healed, the city's residents returned to their routines, but the memory of that morning never fully faded. The bus stop, once a place of innocent chatter, now carried a weight of sorrow, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the unpredictability of human despair. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees near Noburito Park, it was as if the echoes of that day lingered, a whisper of a tragedy that had changed a community forever. Story 10. The night of March 4th, 2012, was warm and restless in Centurion, a sprawling suburb south of Pretoria, South Africa. The air carried the hum of distant traffic and the faint buzz of cicadas, a familiar soundtrack to the residents of Nandi Mbazan's quiet apartment complex. Inside her flat, the 27-year-old business consultant was caught in a moment of chaos that would end her life. Nandi, a vibrant woman with a contagious laugh and a spirit that lit up any room, had moved to Johannesburg from her hometown of Durban to chase a career in finance. Her flat, a modest space filled with books and framed photos of her family, was her sanctuary. But that night, it became a crime scene, its walls stained with her blood and its silence broken by a violent struggle. Nandi's ex-boyfriend, Zwelabonzi Zweli Zungu, a man whose charm masked a history of violence, would soon stand accused of her murder, leaving a family shattered and a community grappling with the loss of a young woman whose life was cut tragically short. Nandi Mbizana was born in 1985 in Durban, a coastal city where the Indian Ocean met the vibrant pulse of KwaZulu-Natal. The youngest of 3 siblings, she grew up in a tight-knit family, her mother, Thandi, a schoolteacher who instilled in her a love of learning, and her father, Sifo, a mechanic with a quiet strength. Nandi was the family's pride, a bright student who excelled in mathematics and dreamed of a career in business. Her laughter, described by friends as contagious, filled their modest home, where Sunday dinners were a ritual of stories and shared dreams. After earning a degree in finance from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Nandi moved to Johannesburg in 2010, landing a job as a business consultant at a logistics firm. Her colleagues admired her work ethic and warmth, her desk adorned with a small cactus and a photo of her mother smiling at the beach. In Johannesburg, Nandi's life was a blend of ambition and joy. She loved the city's energy, its rooftop bars and weekend markets, but she never lost her Durban roots, calling her mother weekly to share updates and jokes. She had recently started dating Oliver Matlala, a kind-hearted man she met through work. Their relationship was new, just a few weeks old, but filled with promise. Oliver, a soft-spoken IT technician, was smitten by Nandi's energy, her ability to make even mundane moments feel special. Yet Nandi's past lingered in the form of Zweli Zungu, her ex-boyfriend of 2 years. Zweli, a 30-year-old businessman with a polished exterior, had a darker side. Friends knew him as charming but volatile, his temper flaring in moments of jealousy. Nandi had ended their relationship in 2011, tired of his controlling nature, but Zweli struggled to let go, his calls and texts a persistent shadow. On the evening of March 4th, Nandi and Oliver were at her flat, sharing a quiet dinner of takeaway curry and rice. The mood was light, their conversation drifting from work to plans for a weekend getaway. Around midnight, the air shifted. A loud knock startled them, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. Zweli, who still had a key to Nandi's flat from their time together, burst in, his face twisted with rage. What followed was a violent confrontation, the details of which would later emerge in court. Zweli, fueled by jealousy, attacked Oliver, striking him repeatedly until blood streamed from his head. Nandi, caught in the chaos, tried to intervene, her voice rising in panic. Zweli turned on her, his anger unchecked. Oliver, dazed and bleeding, was forced to leave, stumbling to Nandi's car and driving to his mother's house in Bramley. Nandi was left alone with Zweli, her fate sealed in the hours that followed. The next morning, Nandi's absence was a quiet alarm. She didn't answer her phone, her usual morning texts to friends unanswered. Her close friend, Fium, a fellow consultant who shared Nandi's love of coffee and long chats, grew worried when Nandi didn't show up for work. Fium called Oliver, who recounted the night's events, his voice heavy with guilt. Together, they went to Nandi's complex, joined by a colleague and a security guard. The door to her flat was locked, but when they forced it open, the scene inside was chilling. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor. Blood stained the carpet, later confirmed to be Nandi's, and fingerprints on a glass and a door handle pointed to Zweli's presence. Nandi was nowhere to be found. Fium alerted the police, her hands shaking as she dialed. The Centurion police arrived, their initial response marked by a frustrating nonchalance. They took statements from Oliver and Fium, noting the blood and fingerprints, but seemed reluctant to act swiftly. Oliver, still reeling from the assault, was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping, a move that would later prove to be a grave misstep. He described the police's brutality, hours of interrogation, accusations that his tattoos marked him as a criminal, and most harrowing, a session at the Germiston Organized Crime Unit where officers tied wires to his toes and electrocuted him. They thought I knew where she was, Oliver later told News 24, his voice breaking. I was terrified they'd kill me. After hours of torture, he was released, the police driving him to his mother's house and leaving him bruised and shaken. The investigation shifted when forensic evidence linked Zweli to the scene. Fingerprints and DNA confirmed he had been in Nandi's flat that night, and the blood on the carpet was hers. The police issued a warrant for Zweli's arrest, offering a 50,000 rand reward for information on his whereabouts. Yusuf Abramji, head of Crime Line, urged the public to come forward, emphasizing the anonymity of their tip line. Somebody knows where Zungu is, he told IOL, his voice firm. We believe he can help us in our investigation. Zweli, however, had vanished, his phone off and his usual haunts empty. The police also sought Nandi, clinging to the faint hope she was alive, but her family braced for the worst. Thandim Bazan, Nandi's mother, sat in her Durban home, clutching a photo of her daughter, her prayers a quiet plea for answers. The weeks that followed were a blur of anguish and action. Fium, devastated by her friend's disappearance, posted on social media, her words raw with grief. I wish Nandi was at her desk right now, she wrote on her blog, Miss Neudel. I wish her family weren't going through this turmoil. The post went viral, shared by friends and strangers alike, amplifying the search for Nandi. Flyers with her photo, a smiling young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, appeared across Centurion and Pretoria. The media picked up the story, with outlets like YNCA and Times Live reporting on the case's chilling details. The blood in Nandi's flat, the violent altercation, and Zweli's history of abuse painted a grim picture. Friends described Nandi as a source of light, her laughter a constant in their lives. She was always happy, Fium told YNCA, her voice cracking. This doesn't make sense. Zweli's past came under scrutiny. Classmates from his university days, including Fium, recalled his volatile nature. He had been involved in a political organization, his charisma drawing people in, but his relationships were marked by control and aggression. He has a violent history, Fium wrote, her words heavy with regret. I wish I could not believe he's capable of this, but I do. Women who had dated Zweli shared stories of emotional and physical abuse, their accounts corroborating the police's suspicions. The manhunt intensified, with police raiding properties in the East Rand and KwaZulu-Natal, but Zweli remained elusive, a ghost in the system. In April 2012, the police's focus sharpened. Brigadier Neville Malila, a Gauteng police spokesman, addressed the media, his tone urgent. We know the public can assist, he said, reiterating the reward for information. The case bore eerie similarities to the disappearance of Frances Razuge, a 23-year-old woman who vanished in 2004 and whose remains were later found, her boyfriend convicted of her murder. The comparison fueled public interest, with true crime forums buzzing with theories. Some speculated Nandi had been kidnapped, others that Zweli had killed her in a fit of rage and disposed of her body. The absence of Nandi's remains became a haunting question, her family torn between hope and despair. Zweli's surrender in May 2012 was a turning point. He walked into a Pretoria police station, his demeanor calm but guarded, and was arrested on charges of murder and kidnapping. In court, he applied for bail, claiming police brutality and alleging officers had assaulted his mother and bugged his phone. Investigating officer Ignatius Kruger refuted the claims, testifying that Zweli was the last person seen with Nandi and posed a risk to witnesses if released. The state opposed bail, citing the blood evidence and Zweli's history of violence. The court denied his application, and Zweli remained in custody at Pretoria Central Prison, his trial set for late 2015. The wait for justice was agonizing for Nandi's family. Thandi traveled to Pretoria for every court appearance, her face etched with grief. She spoke little to the media, her pain too raw for words, but her presence was a quiet force, a mother's refusal to let her daughter's story fade. Saifo, Nandi's father, stayed in Durban, caring for her siblings, who were struggling with their own loss. Nandi's older brother, Mlungizai, took to social media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. "She was our light," he wrote. "We need to know what happened." The family's pain resonated with South Africans, many of whom saw Nandi's story as a stark reminder of the country's epidemic of gender-based violence. Oliver, meanwhile, grappled with the trauma of his arrest and torture. He filed a complaint with the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, IPID, but was told the statute of limitations had lapsed. "I'm okay physically," he told News 24 in 2016, "but I never got counseling. I wake up shaking sometimes." His ordeal highlighted the police's mishandling of the case, their rush to pin blame on him, delaying the focus on Zweli. Oliver's relationship with Nandi, so brief yet meaningful, became a source of guilt. "I should have stayed," he said, his voice heavy. "Maybe she'd be here." The trial began on October 5, 2015, in the North Gauteng High Court, a modern building in Pretoria where the air was thick with anticipation. Zweli, dressed in a dark suit, sat impassively as the prosecution, led by advocate Thandi Mabe, laid out the case. The evidence was damning: Nandi's blood in the flat, Zweli's fingerprints, and Oliver's testimony about the assault. Forensic experts confirmed the blood matched Nandi's DNA, and a neighbor reported hearing shouts and a struggle that night. The prosecution argued Zweli had killed Nandi in a jealous rage, likely disposing of her body to cover his tracks. "This was no accident," Mabe told the court, her voice steady. "This was a calculated act by a man who couldn't accept rejection." Zweli's defense, led by attorney Johan Pretorius, claimed there was no proof Nandi was dead. Without a body, they argued, the murder charge was speculative. Zweli testified, claiming he had left Nandi's flat after a heated argument, insisting she was alive when he departed. He admitted to assaulting Oliver, but denied harming Nandi. "I loved her," he said, his voice low. "I would never hurt her." The defense called a character witness, a former colleague who described Zweli as driven but not violent, but the testimony did little to sway the court. The prosecution's case was bolstered by Zweli's prior behavior, with 2 ex-girlfriends testifying to his abusive tendencies, their stories chillingly consistent. The absence of Nandi's body was the defense's strongest point, but it wasn't enough. On November 10, 2015, Judge Peter van der Walt delivered the verdict. Zweli Zungu was found guilty of murder. The court satisfied that the circumstantial evidence, blood, fingerprints, and witness accounts, proved his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the judge's words ringing in the silent courtroom. "You took a young woman's life and left her family in endless pain." Thandi, seated in the gallery, wept quietly, her hands clutching a photo of Nandi. Fium, who had attended every day of the trial, hugged her, their shared grief a silent bond. The conviction brought closure, but no peace. Nandi's body was never found, a fact that haunted her family. Thandi spoke to Times Live after the verdict, her voice soft but resolute. "I want to know where my daughter is," she said. "I want to lay her to rest." The police continued to search, following tips to rural areas in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, but the leads went cold. Theories abounded. Some believed Zweli had disposed of Nandi's body in a river, others that he had accomplices who helped conceal the crime. Zweli, from his cell in Pretoria Central Prison, maintained his silence, offering no clues to her whereabouts. The case sparked outrage in South Africa, where gender-based violence was a national crisis. Activists pointed to Nandi's murder as a call to action, urging stronger protections for women and better police training. The mistreatment of Oliver, tortured and wrongfully arrested, fueled demands for accountability, with organizations like Sonk Gender Justice citing the case in their campaigns. Fium became an advocate, speaking at rallies about Nandi's life and the need for change. She was more than a victim, Fium told a crowd in Johannesburg. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. "We have to fight for her and all the women like her." In Centurion, Nandi's flat was cleaned and re-rented, but the memory of her lingered. Neighbors left flowers at the complex gate, a quiet tribute to a woman they barely knew, but whose loss they felt deeply. Thandi and Sifo created a small memorial in their Durban home, a corner with Nandi's photos and her favorite scarf, a place to remember her light. Mlunjizai, now a father, named his daughter Nandi, a way to keep his sister's spirit alive. Oliver, scarred by his experience, moved to Cape Town, seeking a fresh start but carrying Nandi's memory with him. The murder of Nandi Mbizan was a tragedy that rippled beyond her family, exposing the fragility of safety and the cost of unchecked violence. In Pretoria, the case became a touchstone, a reminder of the women lost to jealousy and rage. Thandi's prayers continued, her hope for closure fading but never gone. "I feel her sometimes," she told a friend, her eyes on the ocean. "She's with me, even if I can't find her." For those who knew Nandi, her laughter echoed in their memories, a sound that no verdict could silence. Her story, one of love and loss, remains a call to vigilance, a plea to protect the light of those who shine brightest. Story 11. The sun hung low over the turquoise waters of San Jose del Cabo, Mexico, on October 28, 2022, casting a golden glow across the resort town's sprawling villas and palm-lined beaches. Shankella Robinson, a 25-year-old entrepreneur from Charlotte, North Carolina, stepped off a plane with 6 companions, her laughter mingling with the warm breeze. She had come to celebrate a friend's birthday, her suitcase packed with colorful dresses, and her heart full of anticipation for a week of relaxation and joy. Shankella, known to her family as Quella, was a vibrant woman whose braided hairstyles and infectious smile had built her a thriving business back home. But within 24 hours, her life would end in a brutal act of violence. Her body left lifeless in a luxury villa, and her family plunged into a relentless quest for justice. The story of Shankella Robinson's murder would unravel through a chilling video, conflicting autopsies, and a trans-border investigation that exposed the fragility of trust and the weight of unanswered questions. Shankella was born on January 9, 1997, in Charlotte, a city of bustling streets and close-knit communities. The youngest of Bernard and Salamandra Robinson's 2 children, she grew up in a home filled with love and ambition. Her mother, Salamandra, a hairdresser with a knack for making everyone feel seen, taught Shankella the art of braiding, a skill she turned into a business called Exquisite Kids and Braids. Her father, Bernard, a reserved man who worked in construction, was her quiet champion, proud of her drive. Shankella's childhood was marked by her warmth. She was the girl who hugged strangers, who danced at family cookouts, and who dreamed of building something bigger. After graduating from West Charlotte High School, she attended Winston-Salem State University, where she studied business and made lifelong friends, some of whom would join her on that fateful trip to Mexico. By 2022, Shankella was a rising star. Her braiding business flourished, her Instagram filled with photos of intricate hairstyles and glowing clients. She also ran a women's fashion clothing line, her entrepreneurial spirit a source of pride for her family. She was a go-getter, Salamandra told CNN, her voice soft with memory. She had a caring heart. Shankella's life was busy but joyful, her days spent juggling appointments and her evenings filled with laughter over dinners with her sister, Quilla, or phone calls with her parents. When a friend proposed a group trip to Cabo for a birthday celebration, Shankella jumped at the chance. She packed her bags, called her mother to share her excitement, and boarded a flight with 6 others, friends and acquaintances from her university days, including Khalil Cook, Wena Donovan, Alice Hyatt, Nazir Wiggins, Malik Dyer, and Dejani Jackson. The group arrived at Villa Hacienda 32, a sleek, modern rental in the exclusive Puerto Los Cabos neighborhood, its glass walls opening to a pool and ocean views. Shankella, dressed in a striped shirt, snapped photos with her friends, her smile wide as they toasted to the weekend. That evening, she called Salamandra, her voice bright. "I'm having a good time," she said, laughing about the villa's luxury. "Love you, Mom. I'll talk to you tomorrow." Salamandra hung up, her heart light, unaware that those would be her daughter's last words to her. The next day, October 29th, would shatter everything. The call came in the early afternoon, a voice on the other end trembling with news that didn't make sense. One of Shankella's friends, speaking in halting tones, told Salamandra that her daughter was sick, that she had been drinking too much and wasn't feeling well. Hours later, another call delivered the unthinkable. Shankella was dead, found unresponsive in the villa's living room. The friend claimed it was alcohol poisoning, a tragic accident after a night of partying. Salamandra's world tilted, her hands shaking as she gripped the phone. Bernard, hearing her cries, rushed to her side, his face ashen. They demanded answers, but the group's responses were vague, their stories shifting like sand. "Something's not right," Salamandra told Bernard, her voice a mix of grief and suspicion. The Robinsons' grief was raw, a wound that deepened with every unanswered question. The group returned to Charlotte, delivering Shankella's suitcase to her parents' doorstep, their faces somber but their words sparse. They repeated the story of alcohol poisoning, insisting there had been no fight, no foul play. Bernard, a man of few words, studied their expressions, sensing a hollowness in their assurances. Salamandra, unable to bear the silence, pressed for details, but the group dispersed, their phones going unanswered. The Robinsons turned to the authorities, hoping for clarity, but the initial response from Mexican police was maddeningly slow. A police report, later obtained by ABC News, stated that a doctor was called to the villa at 2:13 p.m. on October 29th, finding Shankella dehydrated and unresponsive, her friends insisting she had been drinking heavily. The doctor advised hospital transfer, but the group refused, saying she should stay at the villa. By 4:49 p.m., Shankella had no pulse, and despite CPR and adrenaline, she was declared dead at 5:57 p.m. The official narrative unraveled when an autopsy report, released on November 10th, revealed a chilling truth. Shankella had not died of alcohol poisoning. Her cause of death was listed as a severe spinal cord injury and atlas luxation, a dislocation of the neck's top vertebrae, sustained just 15 minutes before her death. The document classified the death as accidental or violent, a stark contradiction to the group's claims. The Robinsons, already grappling with loss, were now consumed by rage and betrayal. "They lied to us," Salamandra told The Independent, her voice breaking. "My baby didn't die from drinking. Someone hurt her." The case took a seismic turn on November 15th, when a video surfaced online, its contents so horrifying it sparked a firestorm. The 20-second clip, shared across social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram, showed Shankella being brutally attacked in a bedroom of the villa. A woman, later identified by the Robinsons' attorneys as Dejani Jackson, delivered a flurry of punches and kicks, slamming Shankella to the floor. Shankella, disoriented and defenseless, tried to shield herself, her voice weak as she murmured. No, in the background, a male voice, believed to be one of the group, taunted, "Quella, can you at least fight back?" Another voice laughed, the sound chilling against the violence unfolding. The video ended abruptly, but its impact was immediate, going viral and drawing outrage from black activists and online communities who demanded justice. The Robinsons watched the video in horror, their grief now laced with fury. "I couldn't believe it," Bernard told, his voice heavy with pain. "My daughter beaten like that," and they stood there watching. The video, coupled with the autopsy, shattered the narrative of alcohol poisoning. Mexican authorities, under pressure from the growing public outcry, reclassified Shankella's death as a femicide, a gender-based killing, a crime Mexico had codified to address its epidemic of violence against women. On November 24th, Baja California Sur's Attorney General, Daniel de la Rosa Anaya, announced an arrest warrant for an unnamed friend of Shankella's, describing the act as direct aggression, not an accident. He confirmed the suspect was an American woman, and that Mexico was working with Interpol and the U.S. to seek her extradition. The FBI opened its own investigation, confirming to the Charlotte Observer that it was probing Shankella's death in Cabo San Lucas. The Robinsons, desperate for action, leaned on their attorneys, Ben Crump and Sue Ann Robinson, no relation to the family, to push for answers. Crump, a prominent civil rights lawyer, and Sue Ann, a tenacious advocate, became the family's voice, holding press conferences and demanding diplomatic intervention. "This is about justice for a young woman who deserved better," Crump told reporters at Livingstone College in Salisbury, his words echoing across news outlets. Suen traveled to Mexico, meeting with local authorities who shared investigative files and expressed frustration at the U.S.'s slow response to their extradition request. "Heads of state need to talk to heads of state," she said, her voice firm at a March 2023 press conference. U.S. citizens cannot commit crimes abroad and think they're safe back home. The investigation was mired in complexity, a tangle of jurisdictions and conflicting evidence. The Mexican autopsy pointed to a broken neck and spinal injury, but a U.S. autopsy, conducted after Shankella's body was embalmed and returned to Charlotte, found no spinal injury, only brain swelling, and deemed the cause of death undetermined. The discrepancy, noted by Suen, was attributed to the delay in the U.S. investigation, which allowed critical evidence to degrade. "The U.S. didn't prioritize this case," she told ABC News, her frustration palpable. "When you embalm a body, you lose the ability to detect certain injuries." The Robinsons felt abandoned, their trust in authorities eroding as weeks turned to months with no arrests. Salamandra, speaking to NBC News, expressed her anguish. "They looked me in the face and lied. I want them to answer for what they did to my daughter." The public's role was pivotal. Black activists and online sleuths, galvanized by the video, kept Shankella's story alive, sharing her photo, a radiant young woman in a pink dress, and demanding accountability. A GoFundMe campaign raised nearly $370,000, including a $65,000 donation from NBA player Kyrie Irving, to support the family's legal efforts. Community groups like the Million Youth March of Charlotte and Salisbury organized events, including a balloon release on what would have been Shankella's 26th birthday, January 9, 2023. Pink envelopes, her favorite color, filled with letters to Mexican authorities, flooded mailboxes, a symbol of the community's refusal to let the case fade. "Every pink envelope is a reminder," activist John C. Barnett told the Charlotte Observer. "We won't stop until there's justice." Yet justice remained elusive. On April 12, 2023, the U.S. Attorney's offices for the Middle and Western Districts of North Carolina announced they would not pursue federal charges, citing insufficient evidence. "The available evidence does not support a federal prosecution," U.S. Attorneys Sandra J. Hairston and Dina J. King stated, noting that the U.S. autopsy and investigative materials fell short of proving a federal crime beyond a reasonable doubt. The decision crushed the Robinsons, who met with prosecutors that morning, their hopes dashed. Suen, speaking at a press conference at Little Rock AME Zion Church, was resolute. "We're disappointed but not deterred. Black and brown people have always had to carve their own path to justice." She hinted at a civil lawsuit against the 6 travel companions, accusing them of lying by omission by failing to disclose the assault. The lack of U.S. charges did not halt Mexico's efforts. The arrest warrant for Dejani Jackson, identified by the Robinsons' attorneys as the woman in the video, remained active, but extradition stalled. Paul Arnell, an associate professor at Robert Gordon University, told Newsweek that political tensions between the U.S. and Mexico could complicate the process. If Mexico has refused to send persons to the U.S. may act similarly, he said, highlighting the diplomatic hurdles. The Robinsons planned a march to the State Department on May 19, 2023, marking 200 days since Shankella's death, to demand action. "We need the Biden administration to step up," Suen told reporters, her voice a mix of exhaustion and resolve. As the one-year anniversary of Shankella's death approached on October 29, 2023, the case remained unresolved. Bernard stood at his daughter's gravesite, his words a vow. "Justice will be served. I won't rest until it is." The family filed a lawsuit against the 6 companions, alleging they hindered the investigation by concealing the assault. The suit, announced by Suen to Newsweek, aimed to hold them accountable, even if criminal charges were out of reach. Shankella was an educated, vibrant woman who went on vacation and came home in a box, Suan said, her words a searing indictment. No one should spend their last moments like she did. The villa in San Jose del Cabo stands empty now, its luxury a hollow contrast to the tragedy it witnessed. Shankela's story, amplified by a community that refused to forget, became a symbol of the fight against femicide and the quest for justice across borders. Salamandra keeps her daughter's photo on her mantle, a reminder of the girl who loved pink and dreamed big. "I feel her with me," she told CNN, her eyes wet with tears. "I just want the truth." For Bernard, the pain is a fire that drives him, his voice steady as he speaks her name. The Robinsons' fight continues, a testament to a love that outlasts loss, and a call for a world where no daughter's life ends in silence. Story 12. The rolling hills of Overton County, Tennessee, in the spring of 2019, were a study in quiet beauty. The small town of Hillam, nestled in the upper Cumberland region, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and the rhythm of life was set by the seasons, the hum of farm machinery, and the occasional gossip that rippled through the local diner. But beneath this pastoral calm lay a shadow, a story that would unravel the tranquility of Hillam and leave a family grappling with questions that refused to be answered. At the heart of this story was Aaron Shane Key, a 41-year-old man known to his loved ones as Rabbit, whose death on April 5, 2019, would spark a mystery that lingered like the mist over the Cumberland River. Aaron Shane Key was a man of contradictions. To his family, he was a son, a brother, a friend whose infectious laugh could light up a room. Born in 1978, he had grown up in Hillam, a place where the world seemed to move slower, where the bonds of community were both a comfort and a cage. Aaron was wiry, with a nickname earned from his quick movements and restless energy, traits that had defined him since childhood. He was no stranger to trouble, though. His life had been marked by brushes with the law, minor offenses that spoke more to youthful rebellion than hardened criminality. By 2019, he was trying to piece his life back together, working odd jobs and leaning on the support of his parents, Lisa and her husband, who had always been his anchor. But Aaron carried a weight, a secret he hinted at in hushed conversations with his mother. "I'm in something I can't get out of," he told her one evening, his voice low, his eyes avoiding hers. Lisa pressed him for details, but Aaron only shook his head, the words caught in his throat like a fishhook. On the morning of April 5, 2019, the air was crisp, the kind of spring day that promised renewal but carried a chill that lingered in the bones. Aaron woke early, his mood unusually somber. He asked his father to drive him to a residence on Turkeytown Road, a quiet stretch of countryside dotted with modest homes and sprawling barns. He needed to pick up some belongings, he said, promising to be ready for pickup in half an hour. His father, a man of few words but deep loyalty, agreed, dropping Aaron off at the property just after noon. The house was unremarkable, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a gravel driveway, flanked by a barn-like outbuilding that loomed like a silent witness. Aaron waved as his father drove away, his figure shrinking in the rearview mirror. It was the last time his father would see him alive. 30 minutes later, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic, delivering news that would shatter the Key family. Aaron was dead, found in the barn at the Turkeytown Road residence, a rope loosely around his neck. The official report would call it suicide, a ruling that came swiftly and with the weight of authority. But for Lisa Key, Aaron's mother, the explanation was a wound that refused to heal. The circumstances of her son's death were too strange, too inconsistent, too shrouded in unanswered questions. The 911 call from the scene painted a chaotic picture. A fight involving 5 people, ongoing altercations that had simmered for a week. Yet, when deputies from the Overton County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found Aaron's body lying on its left side in the fetal position, the rope around his neck more a suggestion than a cause. The autopsy would reveal no damage to his neck tissue, only a faint ligature mark, a detail that Lisa clung to like a lifeline. To her, It was evidence that her son's death was no suicide, but something far darker. The story of Aaron Shane Key's death begins not with the rope or the barn, but with the life he led in the years leading up to that April day. Hillam was a small town, its population barely cresting 1,000, and Aaron was a familiar face. He had grown up running through its fields, fishing in its creeks, and dreaming of a life beyond its borders. But dreams were hard to hold on to in a place like Hillam, where opportunities were scarce and the pull of familiarity was strong. Aaron had dabbled in construction, worked as a mechanic's helper, and taken on whatever jobs came his way. He was charming, with a quick wit that endeared him to friends, but he also had a restless streak, a tendency to skirt the edges of trouble. His criminal record was minor. Petty theft, a DUI, nothing that marked him as a threat, but it was enough to make him a known quantity to local law enforcement. In the months before his death, Aaron's behavior had shifted. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his usual buoyancy tempered by something unspoken. Lisa noticed it first, the way he'd linger at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood as if searching for words he couldn't find. He spoke vaguely of debts, of people he owed, of a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. Lisa, a woman whose maternal instincts were as fierce as her resolve, pressed him gently but persistently. "What's going on, Aaron?" she'd ask, her voice soft but firm. He'd shrug, offer a half-smile, and change the subject. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable, a shadow that followed him like a storm cloud. The Turkeytown Road residence was not a place Aaron frequented, at least not according to his family. It belonged to a man named Tommy, a local figure known for his connections to the town's shadier elements. Tommy's property was a hub of sorts, a place where deals were made and debts were settled, often out of sight of the law. Aaron had been there before, Lisa knew, but only in passing, to drop off tools or pick up cash for a job. Why he needed to go there that day, and why he insisted on going alone, was a question that gnawed at her. The 911 call, placed by an unidentified caller, mentioned a fight, a brawl that had erupted in the hours before Aaron's death. 5 people, the caller said, their voices raised, their tempers flaring. Yet, when deputies arrived, the scene was eerily calm, the barn silent except for the creak of its weathered boards. Lisa's visit to the property days after Aaron's death only deepened her suspicions. She found the house reeking of bleach, its floors scrubbed clean, as if someone had erased the evidence of what had happened. In the barn, she collected items the police had overlooked: a rope, frayed and oddly clean, Aaron's hat, stained with blood, an ace bandage he'd worn on his injured foot, discarded in the dirt. These were not the artifacts of a suicide, she thought, but of a struggle, a cover-up. The faint ligature mark, the lack of neck trauma, the blood on the hat, all pointed to a truth the official report seemed determined to ignore. Lisa's grief was raw, a jagged edge that cut through her every waking moment, but it was her anger that drove her forward. She began to ask questions, to demand answers, to challenge the narrative that her son had taken his own life. The Overton County Sheriff's Office was a small operation. Its deputies stretched thin across a rural county where resources were limited, and cases often went unresolved. The lead investigator, Deputy Mark Garrett, was a veteran with a reputation for thoroughness, but even he seemed puzzled by the inconsistencies in Aaron's case. The 911 call was a dead end. The caller's identity was never confirmed, and the phone records led nowhere. Witnesses at the Turkeytown Road residence were uncooperative, their stories vague or contradictory. Tommy, the property owner, claimed he'd been away that day, returning only after Aaron was found. Others who had been present offered little, their memories clouded by fear or complicity. The autopsy report, conducted by the state medical examiner, was clinical and unyielding. Death by hanging, no signs of foul play. But Lisa's findings, the blood, the bleach, the bandage, suggested otherwise, and she refused to let the case fade into obscurity. The community of Hillam was divided. Some believed Aaron had been troubled, his death a tragic but inevitable end to a life on the edge. Others whispered of darker forces, of debts unpaid and scores unsettled. The town's rumor mill churned relentlessly, fueled by the lack of clarity, and the weight of unspoken truths. Lisa became a fixture at the sheriff's office, her presence a quiet but persistent demand for justice. She reached out to local reporters, hoping to shine a light on Aaron's case, but the story struggled to gain traction beyond the pages of the Livingston Enterprise, a small newspaper that covered Overton County with a mix of pride and pragmatism. In an article published in February 2025, the Enterprise detailed the family's concerns, quoting Lisa's plea for public awareness. "We just want the truth," she said, her voice breaking. Aaron deserved better than this. The investigation, such as it was, stalled by the summer of 2019. The sheriff's office cited a lack of evidence, a familiar refrain in a county where resources were scarce and mysteries often went unsolved. But Lisa's resolve only grew stronger. She began to piece together Aaron's final days, tracking down acquaintances, revisiting the Turkeytown Road property, and collecting whatever scraps of information she could. She learned of a local drug ring, a loosely organized network that operated in the shadows of Overton County's rural expanse. Aaron, she suspected, had been entangled in it, perhaps as a courier or a debtor, his involvement the thing he couldn't escape. The blood on his hat, the bleach in the house, the faint ligature mark, all pointed to a confrontation, a moment of violence that had been hastily concealed. The summer of 2019 turned to fall, and the case grew colder with each passing month. Lisa's visits to the sheriff's office became less frequent, not out of resignation but necessity. She had to work, to care for her family, to keep moving forward even as her heart remained tethered to April 5th. The town of Hillam moved on, its attention shifting to new dramas, new tragedies. But for the Key family, the pain was a constant companion, a shadow that lingered in the corners of their home. Aaron's siblings, his nieces and nephews, his friends, they all carried pieces of him, memories of his laugh, his quick wit, his restless spirit. Lisa kept his belongings in a box under her bed. The bloody hat, the rope, the ace bandage, artifacts of a truth she refused to let die. By 2025, 6 years after Aaron's death, the case remained officially closed, a suicide ruling that satisfied no one who knew him. Lisa's efforts had not gone entirely unnoticed. The Livingston Enterprise article sparked renewed interest, if only briefly, prompting a handful of locals to come forward with tips. One man, a former acquaintance of Tommy's, claimed to have overheard a conversation about a problem that needed to be handled days before Aaron's death. Another, a woman who had lived near Turkeytown Road, recalled seeing unfamiliar cars at the property that week, their drivers moving with purpose in the pre-dawn hours. But these were fragments, whispers, nothing solid enough to reopen the case. The sheriff's office, under pressure from budget cuts and a backlog of new cases, had little incentive to revisit a death ruled a suicide. Yet, the mystery of Aaron Shane Key's death refused to fade entirely. It lived in the stories, in the quiet moments when Lisa sat alone with her thoughts, in the questions that hung unanswered like the fog over the Cumberland. Was Aaron's death a desperate act, the culmination of a life weighed down by burdens he couldn't bear? Or was it something more sinister, a crime concealed by the silence of a small town and the indifference of an overworked system? The truth, if it existed, was buried somewhere in the barn on Turkeytown Road, in the blood on a hat, in the faint mark of a rope that told a story no one wanted to hear. For Lisa Key, the fight was not over. She carried her son's memory like a torch, a light she refused to let dim. She spoke his name at community meetings, wrote letters to the sheriff, shared her story with anyone who would listen. Her grief was a fire, her determination a blade, cutting through the apathy that threatened to erase Aaron's story. The town of Hillam, with its quiet hills and hidden secrets, held its breath, as if waiting for the moment when the truth would finally break free. Until then, Aaron Shane Key remained a ghost, a man whose life and death were a riddle, a wound, a mystery that refused to be solved.